So now we come to the final act of this absurdly long production, with a discussion of all the side content that has been made relevant in this. I still have topics from R1 and R2 I haven't covered in here as well, but as I inferred earlier, there's just too much here, and too much baggage attached to just everything by the end, that even this work will not cover everything fans have raised as a grievance. For as loved as the series is, I have yet to find a fan of it that it doesn't find severe faults in it once they take the time to think on it, and have the fridge logic realizations the franchise is paralyzed by take effect. And I have not found a single person that likes the changes made in the movie continuity the original staff themselves has said is straight up non-canon. Just like every other compilation movie series Sunrise has ever done, so why start now? I hope I've explained well enough why those issues may have come to exist from everything I've been able to find, even if such might not be the entire truth or could be a revisionist accounting. But there's a reason the franchise has come to be one of Sunrise's most controversial. Which, again, they could have easily fixed by meeting us halfway on some of the bigger issues, but they have refused to. And thus, here we are. For while a number of the side stories provides critical, need-to-know information required to understand the series correctly, they unfortunately do not change much, and as I have inferred before, do not focus on the things they critically needed to justify all of their story points. And I've already detailed some of that information. Charles and V2's backstory and rise, Lelouch, Suzaku, and Callan's first meetings as children, things that run parallel to events in the background that work to inform others, and Lelouch all but confirming he had some form of feelings for Callan. It's stuff that could have been made into episodes in flashbacks or had a bigger emphasis placed on their part in everything. But they didn't. The audio and picture dramas also detail a number of the characters' meetings, interactions, and motivations that are relevant and important, but had to be cut from or were retroactively added into the main series, and that slightly expanded viewpoint on them is important to everything. But unfortunately, they were once again tread on and contradicted by R2 and the movie continuity. The best of them, though, being a series of postscript meetings of the cast that cleared up some things that were missed and quantified that the cast were at least going to try to learn from how badly they messed up during R2's events, as they finally realized what it cost them, which left them stuck with Suzaku instead of the friend, comrade, and loved one who, by their own actions, they had done wrong by. And then there are all the other side story items that either focuses on different characters that are all in some way based upon paralleling proxies of Lelouch, Callan, and Suzaku in this, because as has been my thesis, this franchise has never escaped that narrative trinity. Or there are varied alternate universe takes on the series that remix details of the story or setting. And wow, there were a lot of those released between 2007 and 2012, to the point I might have missed some of them, when the zeitgeist for the series was at its highest. And that, of course, was the OVA series Akito the Exiled, released throughout the early 2010s. Though, if you didn't see this series, well, this OVA ended up with a mixed reputation to it. Not just because it took them 5 years to release the damn thing by its end, but also in part because the original characters part of it were just not that engaging by comparison, and more poorly addressed racial victimization than the main series did, which played into the worst stereotypes about displaced refugees. Akito the Exiled gave context to the European front of Britannia's war during the time skip between R1 and R2, and by its end seemed almost tailor-made to confirm people's negative opinions about several elements of the setting, without its depiction of things was consistent with the criticism of Suzaku and perceived scapegoating victimization of Lelouch. Said as beginning right at the climax of Code Geass R1, Akito the Exiled is the story of Akito Hyuga, a Japanese exile living in the European Union, and conscripted into military service as part of the EU's Wyvern Zero unit, a suicide unit used by the EU's military as sacrificial lambs thrown at the forces of Euro-Britannia so their actual soldiers and countrymen would not need to die. In the same way, honorary Britannians that were former numbers are the same sorts of cannon fodder. However, his commanding officer, the strategist Layla Malkal, considers that a waste of his life, and that of others. and the callousness of her superiors is a point of contention between them and her, as her wastefulness is only causing them to suffer attrition in the face of Britannia actually, doing something to keep their pilots alive. Layla is a former Britannian noblewoman, her parents having been killed when she was young, and due to a freak meeting with CC after the incident when, by timeline, CC should not have been there at all to grant it to her, she is in possession of a recessive Geass. As she was too young for CC to grant a full contract to her, which is again contradicted by prior material where she did, but that's neither here nor there, as Layla's never willingly activated it until the events of the OVA. And Akito, likewise, is under the effects of a Geass. His elder brother Shin, who was adopted into Euro-Britannia's nobility as Shin-Hyuga Shang, somehow came into possession of one thanks to a code-bearing skull. Yes, seriously. This is where the supernatural mythos arc of the series jumped the shark for people who weren't sick of it already. That allows him to make anyone he uses it upon kill themselves. However, Akito's expression of this command is abnormal, because due to the age in which Akito was first afflicted by it, he had not conceptualized the meaning of death yet. Thus, it is instead expressed that when he is put in life-threatening circumstances, he is turned into a berserker, attacking anyone and anything near him, and ironically that has allowed him to survive everything up until now, even as the possibility he could be forced to become a raging monster has isolated him from any comrade he could have gained. While Shin himself uses that power to rise up among the Euro-Britannian hierarchy by killing anyone that gets in his way.
So you die, Captain, and we all move up in rank.
Including those on Shin's side that actually are more moderate and reasonable than the normal Britannian royalty, showing that had Lelouch been able to be emperor normally and done right by the role, there would have been sects in the Britannian government that would have more than supported him. Which also likewise better presents Emperor Charles's own self-serving hypocrisy in how he could have made things better, but refused to because of his obsession with killing God. With the story ultimately turning on the need for Layla and Akito to unite with other Japanese exiles in fielding the experimental Alexander Knightmare frames to match Britannia's aces, and for their software that can interlink the minds of the pilots be used to overcome the insanity that system thus inflicts upon them because of Akito's death command. All before Shin can use his death Geass enough to rise up in Britannia's ranks to create a region which will never know an end to war. Well, at least it all was, until Sunrise saw the actual sales for the OVA's direct-to-home video releases in Japan. And they were not good. Which, as I inferred before, should have been their biggest red flag that something had gone wrong due to Sunrise not allowing the series to end as intended, as the enforced ambiguity of R2 was now coming back to bite them. As the OVA's story on its own, the way I'm describing it, there's not necessarily that much egregiously wrong with it, at least until they drag Codes and Geass into the forefront of it again. Its biggest issue, with retrospect, was that people didn't like it because it was not about Lelouch, Callan, and Suzaku. Except, it was about Lelouch, Callan, and Suzaku. For you see, the key to nearly every Code Geass spin-off to date is all of them revolve around 3 characters that fulfill the same narrative and story rules as Lelouch, Callan, and Suzaku. See why I keep insisting that it has to be the 3 of them that are the core characters in this? Layla takes the role of Lelouch of strategist opposing Britannia due to events of their backstory. Akito the Callan role of the persecuted sword charging alongside their strategist in battle and acting as their love interest. And Shin the Suzaku role of collaborator with the conqueror that has ambitions to rise to the top while ignoring the reality of the world, as they'll just rewrite it when they have power to be what they want it to be. But of course, the character roles differ. Layla is not as reserved as Lelouch and puts herself in an existing power structure. Akito doesn't have the mixed blood ancestry, and Shin is much more overt in his grasp for power without any of the self-justifying moral aggrandizing bullshit people came to loathe about Suzaku.
雑魚どもは一掃する作戦は俺が立てる足引っ張んなよスカボンタヌキども何でもいいあいつらの首は私にちょうだい
But nonetheless, it ended up shooting itself in the foot. as because it was not about Lelouch, and audiences still had grievances against just everything. Everything in R2, people who might have been open to a side story like this were not. Even though Akito's story started out lacking most of the baggage Code Geass had become saddled by. But that wasn't being recognized because the audience for it didn't care about it at all if it wasn't about properly settling and getting closure for the circumstances of Lelouch's death. And so, he was written in, and presented to the audience in terms of, is it him? For the series consequently introduces Julius Kingsley, which is where it subsequently goes off the rails. Julius, as one could guess, is in fact Lelouch, and because Akito is set just after R1 is, it's what provides the context of Suzaku literally selling Lelouch into slavery to gain a position as one of the Emperor's royal knights. This being what happens to Lelouch immediately after all of that happens. Charles uses his memory-altering Geass to completely brainwash Lelouch into believing he is the aforementioned Julius, and by removing the memories of his experiences and those he loves and values, including Nunnally, as well as his morality and life philosophies, he is turned into a monster, happily causing suffering for his own amusement in the execution of his schemes and duties to the crown. All with Suzaku acting as his handler who looks the other way to all of these acts, as long as it is in the service of Britannia. And Suzaku acts as if this shall be his penance for his crimes, which, again, he's already been exonerated for.
Do you know what it's like to wake up one day and discover you're a monster, a murderer? What if I had died, Theo, never knowing what I had been? How can I confess my sins to God if I don't even know what they are? The mind forgets, but the stain remains with the soul. The blood of innocent people is still on my hands, and everything that I have done has been a lie.
That's not true, Edward. You've helped people, cared for people.
It's not enough.
Hell, what has been done to Lelouch with Suzaku watching on when it was done to him, being actually worse than what was done to Euphemia, making it a plausible out if the story wanted to take it, of, hey, since this is the same thing that happened to Euphemia, maybe they did it to her instead of Lelouch, or Lelouch was used against her in this exact way to set up the circumstances of the massacre. But of course, Suzaku does not consider that because he doesn't ever think about his actions or what is actually going on around him. Because of course, Suzaku does not care about the reality of the situation, only what is in front of him and what he thinks is correct. So what does it matter that Lelouch is being abused in these same ways, and even more extremely than Euphemia was, as long as he gets what he wants out of it? Even if the Lelouch he is now dealing with has no memories of what he even did. This drawing the pair into conflict with Shin as well, due to their mission there to raise Europe to the ground, getting in the way of Shin's own grasp for more power. And while there is some draw to that, given more context to how monstrous the Emperor is and how complicit Suzaku is in their atrocities as long as it makes him the one on the right, you can't get past the fact that this is an exact repetition of what people hated about R2's endgame in the first place. Suzaku using the genius of a mentally broken Lelouch to get his way and force Lelouch to commit more and worse atrocities intentionally than Lelouch did by accident, or what Euphemia was wrongly blamed for. The only difference between the Akito OVA having Suzaku do this and R2 doing it is it's more overt and deliberate about it.
地球の王様にまで上り詰めてどんな気分だった？
気持ちよかったよ。正義感は罪悪感を塗りつぶし、簡単に人を化け物に変える。そうだ。力に酔っていた。だから権力は
救えねえな。最高の反面教師だな。俺の目指すてっぺんはそこにはね。
Though that, in a sense, comes off as a reflection of the writer's views on the setting, as Akito the Exiled was not written by the previous Code Geass staff members, which makes these things both better and worse. The head writer for the Akito OVAs was Hiroshi Onogi, better known for his work on the Super Dimensional Fortress Macross and Super Dimension Century Orgus series, the Aquarion franchise, and some assorted episodes of Gundam's Zeta, Seed, and Seed Destiny. And by proxy of those series, it certainly shows. Onogi at the time, from what I've been able to scrounge up, was attempting to voice the audience's discontent with the series through his own addition to it. That's why it played part in codifying Suzaku as a hard villain of the series, especially in how he has continuously abused Lelouch throughout their lives. Like, there was no arguing this point anymore by the time the OVAs included them. As children, Suzaku beats Lelouch up when he proves him wrong. As teenagers, Suzaku bends over backwards to justify things that are wrong, while criminalizing accidents and collateral damage as the worst atrocities one could perform, despite them acting without the malicious intent his side bears, while also acting to validate how poorly Lelouch was treated by his family. When he gains real power, he doesn't use it to help the people he promised to, while blocking Lelouch from fulfilling his promises. And he walks Lelouch to his own death to take the symbol of power Lelouch had forged for himself. Suzaku, thus acting as Lelouch's handler when he's Julius, consequently isn't an outlier. It's telling you loud and clear what the pattern is. And moreover, it showcases how a Lelouch without his morality is no different than Schneisel, which further evidences in the main series when Lelouch was honest and when he wasn't, and that the European Union in the Code Geass universe is no better than Britannia or anywhere else, with its classist racism and victimization of lower peoples not part of their original nationality, only with even less subtlety about it. Akito is constantly morally dark because of several of the things it does and showcases, as thanks to it not airing on broadcast television, it could push the envelope farther with regards to what they could showcase. But by battling the appearance of it's not what fans wanted, and then whatever story they could have focused on trying to put Lelouch back to the picture without Callan around, it just does not end up working in my opinion. It only made the discourse around the series worse when, ironically, had they not included Lelouch and Suzaku, a solo story would have actually handled itself better. Like, I've got nothing against the love story between Akito and Layla. Layla herself is a very intriguing tactician with how she gives Britannia's best to run for their money. And Akito's conflict with his former brother is a case where the writer and audience are using them as proxies for Lelouch and Suzaku, where we're screaming at Akito for him to just let his brother go. He's too far gone. And the OVA actually allows the story to capitulate on that point, with how the respective characters have been remixed into these new counterparts to voice our own grievances. But for everything that makes me want to like the OVA, it does something that detracts from it, such as the mess with the cognitive entity, the Dimensional Supervisor, that's basically a Geass Force Ghost, representing the direct consciousness of the god that Charles wants to kill, and the further complications invoked regarding the franchise's entire supernatural mythos arc. In specific, the aforementioned Geass Skull, some other malicious entity that is actually responsible for granting Shin his Geass, that seems to be, but is never confirmed, as a metaphysical incarnation of humanity's malice that is supposed to be the origin of what all codes and Geass come from. But that is all naught but speculation, as the OVA series is not allowed to explain what the hell that was. Because, as explained before, what everything was in relation to the powers part of the supernatural mythos arc were not planned out at all, but created retroactively just to validate CC existing, and that is why they fail. As at this point, with this OVA's conclusion in 2016, a decade after the franchise had begun production, it had become clear that everything related to Code and Geass and the anime stories for the franchise had become one gigantic plot tumor undermining the better stories of the narrative, despite both powers being the literal title of the franchise, and it might have been better had they been excluded from the start. The side story mangas handle the power better, but it's not the same in any regard. This crap basically broke the OVA, as instead of spending its time trying to showcase why we should care about the characters and setting, and them either succeeding or falling to the steamroller that is the strategist opposing them, they weren't given that chance. And personally, I feel like they deserved it, and might have gotten that chance had the original coda for R2 that Sunrise vetoed been allowed to settle previous matters. Though I get the idea that what Inoki intended with the Akito OVA, once Lelouch and Suzaku were edited in, was to enable a backdoor to a Code Geass R3 with all this, with Lelouch's forced upon him identity of the Mad Cardinal Julius Kingsley. If the OVAs were to be included as canon, and officially they were by Sunrise at the time, this gives the storyline an out with regards to Lelouch being slandered for his time as the Demon Emperor. That out being the possibility of someone in power declaring that Julius Kingsley impersonated Lelouch v. Britannia, and Julius Kingsley was the one responsible for everything Emperor Lelouch did as the Demon Emperor through this deception. As such would have matched what and how Julius acted in the confrontation with Europe. In series, Nunnally destroyed Britannia's capital, Pendragon, which would have held the records of who Julius was. So this blame shift to a non-existent person previously seen in Britannia's employ would have been nearly seamless, especially due to Lelouch, thanks to Charles's previous acts of brainwashing, having an alibi of being at Ashford Academy during this period. For obviously, a single person cannot be in two places at once. So if the real Lelouch were found to have been revived from the dead through the power of a Code or Suzaku retcon to have missed all of Lelouch's vital organs in the finale, it would have been easy to spin a lie that Julius was responsible for Demon Emperor Lelouch's crimes by impersonating him, and not Lelouch himself, thus allowing him a plausible return to his friends and family, divorced from this martyr complex and what Suzaku encouraged of him, to actively allow him to make up for what mistakes were his throughout the rest of his life.
貴様らなどこの両の腕さえあれば造作もないわさ本当に思ってる俺様は宇宙をダグデとドゥジェルだお前たちは遊びで滅ぼすものだせーの大成功はあ教官
地球の民をご覧になられましたか先ほど高らかに笑っていた化け物こそ真の黒幕なのです
以前行われた全国放送は地球を守るための芝居に過ぎないジェラミーは無罪
おかげさまで人とバグナラクの仲直りに一歩前進めでたしめでたし
You would also have the opportunity to have an act to redeem Suzaku's character because of it, as if he deliberately missed as part of this charade, it would infer that he was finally listening to his conscience and not acting to validate the indefensible by not murdering his former best friend. Because obviously a man that was publicly executed could not have faked his own death, right? 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 And unfortunately, no, that is not what they eventually did. They could have done it. They had everything lined up to do it. They still could do it in the future if they want to entirely throw out the movie continuity as the disaster it is. But I don't think they will, because I'm of the opinion they don't grasp what the problem is. Still, taken on its own merits again, Akito is certainly not the worst production the franchise has given us, and to once again parallel the character illusions being made, at the very least the Suzaku analog is put down like the monster he is, and the Lelouch and Callan analogs are allowed to hook up. The OVA series ending with Layla, Akito, and their allies surviving the conflict and, after being betrayed by the Europa government, traveling on their own with a group of nomads that have skirted the edges of the wars. Canonically surviving the franchise's entire events as far as any of us are allowed to know. If Sunrise is never going to let us have that ending for the characters they are analogous to, well, at least we do have this. This in turn brings us to the events of Code Geass's first video game, Code Geass Lost Colors, released between Code Geass R1 and R2. which is focused around the character of Rai. Rai is a retcon into canon character, as the game Lost Colors ties directly into the events of R1. Rai being an amnesiac character who stumbles into Ashford Academy early in R1's events, before being taken under the wing of Lelouch. Through the story's events, told in a multi-route visual novel style, Rai can join either the side of Britannia or the Black Knights to play out relevant events. When on the Britannian side, he comes under the stewardship of Nonette Emagram, one of Britannia's Knights of the Round. Or at least, since I have mentioned her before, she's later retconned into being one of them officially, where her character is then grandfathered into the main anime series. She makes multiple unvoiced appearances in R2, after a character became super popular with Japanese audiences because of the game. And Lost Colors is the source of her canonical backstory regarding her having a long-standing friendship with Cornelia, as well as deeper connections to the royal family. Hell, Lost Colors has had such a knock-on effect towards its reception for Code Geass fans that the eventual mobile game Code Geass Lost Stories is heavily based on what it originally did. Whereas, if Rai ends up on the Black Knight's side, he ends up getting close to either CC in the true route of the game, or the other Black Knights girls, while he acts in rivalry with Nonette. His inclusion into this narrative likewise permitting the creation of two units that would end up having infrequent appearances in media after it. The Lancelot Club, that is considered Nonette's personal unit and the prototype of Suzaku's Lancelot, created by supporting characters Lloyd Asplund and Cecile Krumi, as a proof of concept for their final design that they end up developing with Suzaku. And the Gekka pre-production type, which was used by the Guren's designer Rakshata Chawla as a test bed for developing the Radiant Wave Surger that is Callan's signature weapon. For the lore in the setting, which revolves around technology advances and doesn't just pop in out of nowhere, the existence of both units is paramount in broadening narrative scope of the setting. How the game resolves Rai's inclusion, however, is with the eventual revelations around his backstory, about him being another member of the Britannian royal family, born from an affair they had with one of Suzaku's relatives, and ostracized from the greater Britannian family for it, similarly to how Lelouch and Nunnally were due to his status as a half-breed Britannian. Rai living away from the rest of the royal family in a region less stable than others. He was given a Geass by V2 that allowed him to command anyone who heard his voice. He does not require eye contact like Lelouch does. And his use of it during an incident accidentally caused a massacre that took his mother and sister's lives. Rai was subsequently taken by V2 and experimented on, sealed within a form of stasis in the thought elevators, until being discovered by the same research group that originally captured CC, and freed by the events of the series. However, depending on story route, Rai either dies or, in the true ending along the CC route of the game, uses his Geass to erase all memory of his existence before sealing himself away, which thus absolves any continuity snarls the game might impose by him being tied into events. Now, there is an argument on whether Lost Colors is pseudo-canon, because everything related to Nonette is later made completely canon, or if this story is completely non-canon to everything else, and Nonette just becomes divorced from it. And frankly, it can go either way due to the visual novel exploration of the larger story. The CC route that's considered the true route of the game is the one that most conforms with the story's timeline, by him just being blipped out of everyone's minds. But the argument in favor of making it true canon is nonetheless harmed by, well, Jeremiah's Geass canceller existing, as him canceling the Geass effect on anyone would also consequently set off the realization of, oh crap, we forgot about Rai! It's unfortunate that it's another piece of media we didn't get imported, however, as from everything I've ever seen of Lost Colors, it's an interpretation just as intriguing with the mythos and lore as, say, what Super Robot Wars Z did with the main series story in its divergences, and the happy ending path that exists in that game for the franchise's storytelling. Granted, there's a few other non-canon or AU additions to the series, so it's not like there's not precedent for that interpretation either. The original Code Geass manga is something of a condensation of the story, excising the nightmares of the series, which unfortunately is to this manga's detriment, to make the Black Knights and Britannian army more focused on guerrilla warfare and actual army tactics for its tale. It's a list of pros and cons, mostly cons, on the merits of its various divergences, as the story just isn't the same without the mecha involved, especially due to the reevaluation of the Geass Mythos arc as a plot tumor for the franchise, as, by that point, the mecha were kind of essential to actually presenting the battles of the series and giving the heroes of the tale any kind of leverage or equality against Britannia's forces that making them more conventional weapons and guerrilla tactics would not have permitted them. But it's one of the few of these stories to actually respect Callan as a character and the importance of her role in the events of the series as its actual deuteragonist, and does a lot to justify R2's events in better ways than the main story manages, such as by making the Black Knight's betrayal contingent more on Kaguya's personal ambitions, which are then manipulated by Schneisel in why they happen, and less on the entire group being completely brain-dead or acting as traitors to their own cause, as it is in the TV and movie canons respectively. The manga canon version of the story is not perfect in any regard, and really falls into many of the same traps the main story does, simply by the virtue of it being an adaptation. But it at least tries to fix some things, and knows what the actual central focus of the story was supposed to be. Next is Tales of an Alternate Shogunate, which alters the setting of the series to occur in 1853. It likewise excises the robot Knightmares, but instead makes the Knightmares equivalent to a set of summonable supernatural armor tied to the power of Geass. Surprisingly, this was one of the few Code Geass books to actually get out to stores before Bandai Entertainment completely collapsed and prevented us from getting the rest. But I've never found a copy of it. And worse, it turned the power of Geass into just stand users or persona wielders. Well, while there is a fanfic there, several, in fact, that people have written for both Persona and JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, but it more emphasizes my thesis that the supernatural mythos arc was not planned out for them to induce such a significant divergence in capabilities of what is supposed to be. For Geass is based on a psychic power that is only supposed to affect one's mind and perceptions. You don't get to call out avatars of the Epitaph of Twilight from using it.
I am.
And I.
And I.
And I'm
Right here!
The manga Suzaku of the Counterattack, however, instead asks the question, what if Suzaku wasn't a hypocritical jackass and refused to accept he was wrong? And while it's another book that wasn't officially imported, from what I've read about it, it actually is a version of the story where Suzaku isn't a shithead, and realizes he's fighting for the wrong people, so he stops making the wrong decisions, eventually joining forces with Lelouch to stop Schneisel and his scheme to claim immortality through the power of code, before executing his world genocide scheme himself, instead of through a proxy. However, as far as I know, there has been no fan translation of it, and no priority to translate that story by fans due to the general disdain the fandom has towards Suzaku. But it's once again an example of these stories seeing that a happier ending were possible if Suzaku didn't have his head shoved in the sand and acted as a tritagonist who willingly chose to perform a face-heel turn. Next of the AU series is the manga Knightmare of Nunnally, which retells the core Code Geass story, only with Nunnally as the protagonist. In the story, after believing Lelouch to have died in the Shinjuku incident that begins the canonical series, Nunnally encounters a being named Nemo, who after contracting with her, manifests as an albino ghost copy of Nunnally that brings forth the festering darkness in her heart, originating from every awful thing she's experienced but suppressed expression of for the sake of her brother, and lets it run wild because Lelouch is no longer in the picture to suppress it. With her for this contract gaining her own Geass power that grants her the ability to see possible futures, as well as summon a supernatural nightmare, and her actively working to find her missing brother in order to prevent the timeline in which she sees the possibility of his death through the utilization of Nemo's powers, which also restores her crippled body to working order. The Knightmare manga, despite it again going for a more deliberate supernatural focus, is very well regarded due to its central exploration of Nunnally's character that isn't really in conflict with the original series canon. If anything, it more acts as a thematic counterpoint to what was done with Chloe and Spice-and-Wolf as part of their own allusion to Nunnally's canonical self. This story expressing that in contrast to the blind angel the main series tries to keep her as, well, give her the right means, and she should fall from heaven and become the same person Lelouch did in being a Black Knight fighting for justice. The difference coming about from if she just let herself get angry and actually express that, as opposed to the main anime story just using her as a naive, world-oblivious morality chain or motivation for Lelouch, or as she's used in the movies, a victim in need of saving. If you want a story that allows Nunnally to actually be a character, this is it. And yet, this is the only story in the franchise that actually benefits from its focus being upon the more supernatural side of Geass. Primarily because Nunnally is forced from the outset to fight far more Geass users out of the gate. Specifically the faction known as the Irregulars, who feature a girl named Alice, whom Nunnally shares a dynamic that echoes that of Lelouch with both Callan and Suzaku as the story goes on. Alice and her compatriots all field operatives of V2's Geass cult, to show they have a more active role in the story than the canon version of things showcase and allowed, with them being based off of background characters in the original series. And not just Nunnally in this, but many of the Geass users are able to manifest powered nightmares similar to the alternate Shogunate manga. And because of this more physical combat-oriented re-rendition of the series, Lelouch's own Geass manifests differently, this time as an armored form of his Zero suit that grants him immunity to all harm, as well as the ability to hack technology and hijack nightmare frames remotely. Thus, due to not being able to be harmed in battle, is far more open with his allies, so he has a far more positive relationship with the Black Knights that prevents any of the misunderstandings seen of the main story, as this way, he can bridge connections with them. Because of this, and Lelouch not having a brainwashing power, the series-long events that lead to his end, starting with Euphemia's massacre, never take place in this iteration. The downside of this is it's another story that downplays Callan's involvement in, well, everything, though at least in this case, there is a better justification for that, since her story is intertwined with Lelouch's. And this is not Lelouch's story, it's Nunnally's. And thanks to Nunnally's Geass contract restoring her sight by breaking her sperm donor's meddling with her mind, and with her having her own nightmare, well, she does show that she takes after her mother as an amazingly talented nightmare pilot. And while she only has her own battles to fight in the story, the intersection of them does affect what they take from the canon story for their events. For in this case, it becomes a story focused around the feelings between siblings, how life can force them apart, and how difficult it can be to reconcile. The Knightmare manga is also the origin of something of a misconception within the franchise regarding the character Agent Nibarius, aka Rolo Lamperouge, whom I did not mention at all in the R2 recap as he's ultimately irrelevant to most of it, as is the recurring problem with the entire supernatural mythos plot. Rolo is a Geass Order assassin that acts as Lelouch's handler and fake brother in R2, who ends up turned to Lelouch's side due to the familial bond he develops with the brainwashed Lelouch becoming more important to him than his mission. This is also why, once again, the official timeline of events is very difficult to reconcile without spacing everything out farther than it is said to be. If Lelouch is brainwashed and Rolo becomes his fake brother immediately at the end of R1, then they're only together for at most a third to a half of a year from the official timeline, despite them saying a year has passed. Factor Akito into that shortens it to 2 or 3 months. Factor Oz the Reflection into it, where it's revealed that Rolo is in fact the replacement handler after the first one got murdered because of the events of Oz intersecting with Ashford during the time that Lelouch is there while mind screwed. Yeah, that drops it down to less than 1. Rolo is there for less than 1 month as Lelouch's fake brother, and suddenly has more loyalty to Lelouch because the affection showed to him than the cult that raised Rolo from infancy, despite the years-long indoctrination that needed to have taken place? Yeah, no. Now, admittedly, this is technically fixed by the Oz the Reflection manga, by there being multiple defectors from the cult to show that V2 actually is bad at the job of indoctrinating his minions, and any showcase of empathy and humanity to another does open up cracks in their programming to turn on him, but that's certainly a case of Oz fixing multiple things that were wrong with the canon story to begin with. The issue with Rolo, however, has always been just the time needed to justify the bond he forges with Lelouch. We are given little context too, and the repeated shortening of the period they would have been together before R2 starts up just doesn't help. However, due to his upbringing as part of the Order, Rolo is a full-on yandere for the aforementioned sources of affection, happily acting on Lelouch's behalf regardless of the need for him to do so, or the cost or harm to either of them, and thus causes tragedies Lelouch is incapable of stopping, as Rolo doesn't listen to him and so acts unilaterally, all motivated by his Britannian ideological upbringing in the cult that prioritized someone's usefulness over all others as a mark of value, and Rolo not understanding that Lelouch can value a person regardless of what they can do, that love is not and should not be conditional, which is the failing of the entire rest of his family, and one's love for one person does not reduce the love one can feel for others. And it's Rolo's own actions that cause the loss of that, not any other single person. Rolo's inability to reconcile this leads Lelouch to rightfully fear that Rolo would happily murder Nunnally or anyone else he loves if given a chance in order for him to prove how much more value he has than them, how much more worthy of love he is. And it ultimately destroys him as he refuses to listen. And does just that in Rolo being the murderer of Shirley Fennette. As to him, she was a threat, as she dared to take his fake brother's love from him. And all that is all things that the Knightmare manga exploits by Rolo becoming Nunnally's arch-nemesis in her focused upon manga. Once again showing the Sidestories authors were allowed to be smarter about all of this than the main series was allowed to be, thanks to Sunrise's nonsense. The wrench the Knightmare of Nunnally manga introduces into this is Rolo is initially introduced as Lelouch's twin brother, who was taken from the Britannian royal family and inducted into the Geass Order cult at birth due to twin princes being a superstition regarding them bringing misfortune. In reality, the truth of the Knightmare version of Rolo is he was a clone created from the cells of their parents in an attempt to breed an ultimate assassin and tool for the Emperor's goals, which are inevitably still the same as in the canon story in that he wants to kill and usurp the throne of God. So in Knightmare, Rolo genetically is Lelouch and Nunnally's brother, just not born at the same time as either of them. But regardless of that, in this adaptation of the series, it is still fully playing with the same ideas around Rolo's character arc and what ultimately causes his own downfall.
お帰りなさいませ、姫野様。はあ？あら、そちらの姫野様は側近の素顔をご存知なくって？へえ、騙されることには慣れていないのかしら。
さあ、玉座を姫野様に返していただきましょうか。
その薄汚い女がイシャバーナの女王である通りがあって。身を汚せど魂は輝く。力を奪えど心はきらめく。美とは生き様。
Like with Akito, the twin doppelganger excuse is introduced here to give the real Lelouch an excusable out for some of the things he would be forced to do, and more validated because the twin in Knightmare actually exists and did them. But the problem with trying to apply that back into canon, however, is the main timeline doesn't exactly present the idea of cloning technology being present or possible. Oh, cyborg technology is there and makes sense with the series' tech development trees, but not so much cloning. If Rolo was supposed to be the twin of any Britannia royal family member in the canon story to try and deepen that character's personal tragedy, well, it honestly makes more thematic sense for him to be Nunnally's twin that was then taken, as that is then presented as happening in the next manga series we'll be discussing, Oz the Reflection, with the separated birth twins Orpheus and Uldren. But again, as far as I know, that's not part of the main timeline of the tale, and Rolo was just some random kidnapped orphan who the Order indoctrinated and eventually just assigned to the task in the main series because of his own power to stop others' perception of time, at the cost of also stopping his heart when he has it active. Yeah, he eventually dies from heart failure, go figure. But grand scheme of things, yeah, Rolo's largely irrelevant, only there to set off the narrative events that all come as consequence of Shirley being murdered. But ultimately, this is all Nunnally's story, with her being the one to confront their mutual bastard of a sperm donor and stop his schemes, which in this version of events requires specifically her Geass's power to get Charles to his goal, once more entirely removing CC from relevance in the story. With the story's ultimate culmination being the completion of a character arc that opens her up to being able to live independently of her brother, as in this timeline Lelouch is able to complete his contract with CC and succeed in killing her, taking upon himself her code and placing the world order, bestowing Geass to deserving users. As due to things playing out differently, Euphemia actually ends up the one to succeed the throne as ruler of Britannia after Charles is dealt with, and in doing so, frees everyone subjugated in the Empire as a number and slave, though without resolving the other conflicts present in the world, so there's still a lot of global problems to sort out. As in the Knightmare timeline, Lelouch as Zero is not given an opportunity to try and reach out and unite the varied nations of the world into one governing body like the UFN. And with Charles's loss as a central threatening evil, well, there's not exactly a good impetus to bring everyone together to work out their varied issues through diplomacy. Now is there? This once again addressing a story flaw of the original series that just because one enemy of the world was defeated and people freed from tyranny, it does not by default mean that it ends all conflict or inequality in the world forever, and those need to be addressed. And thus, wherever conflict is born, that serves as a source for the birth of the power of kings, with Lelouch at that end being the new broker of such powers, and working behind the scenes from that point forth to make it so the world would become peaceful, no matter how long it takes, as he's got the time now. What? That's my interpretation of the ending, as it doesn't make sense from a character perspective for him to encourage more chaos and conflict, as is the other interpretation. Him granting oppressed people the means to fight back and restore justice to an unfair world, that more fits his depiction throughout these varied stories. Hell, him working behind the scenes to ensure peace, that's pretty much what fans wanted to see him brought back for by him reclaiming the title and position of Zero, as Geass isn't the cause of nor solution to all the world's problems. It's imbecilic to claim that is the case. Let me repeat that for the hard of hearing are those with their heads in the dirt. Geass is not the root cause of everyone's problems in this setting, and it is imbecilic to claim such is the case as an excuse to write out characters from the franchise. But for the longest time, this was also the only closure, and even now it remains the best closure, we had with regards to Lelouch and Nunnally's parting, and certainly a better one for more than just Lelouch living. As in this version, she's not stuck being babysat by her beloved brother's murderer as Lelouch left her to be in canon. As when you think about it, that is so very much fucked up. And no matter how kind Nunnally claims to be, do you really all think she is entirely without resentment? Without that same spark of hate and anger that influenced, but did not define, Lelouch himself from their experiences? That she wouldn't hold against Suzaku what he did, and what he drove Lelouch to do. For Knightmare showcases a Nunnally that is allowed to embrace those feelings to air them, thus being able to resolve them, as opposed to her canon self that can only bottle them up until she drowns in them. In the same way, Lelouch suffered that made him feel like a dead, zombified husk until he awoke to become Zero. And how long, truly, does one think she'd last like that, before she'd come to hate the Suzaku that has been left behind? It's ridiculous to believe that she'd never snap and be crushed by it. After all, that's what happened to Lelouch. So how long would it be? Would it take before the inevitable happens, and she stares at the man responsible for why she lost everything she had left, with all the contempt she can muster?
逃げましょう。あなたが最後です。
来ないで。私の家族は奪われた。王に見捨てられたからです。私はもうあの時死んだ。
深くお詫び申し上げます。今の王たちは誰一人見捨てたりしません。あなたの手は温かい。どうか生きてください。
As the only reason she wouldn't hate Suzaku would of course be the plot, not the characterization, says so. And Knightmare does more to bring that to light if one were to consider her as a character. More relevant to canon, however, is the manga side story Oz the Reflection, which is centered around Lelouch's sister Maribel Mel Britannia and her fights against terrorist organizations throughout the Britannian Empire after a terrorist attack took the life of her mother and sister, as well as the internal power struggles of the Zevon family, who are deeply embedded into the Britannian Black Ops unit Pluton, which is in fact a front for the Geass Order itself. With control of the family having been usurped by Oyagros, I am probably mispronouncing that, Zevron, from former Knight of the Round Olivia Zevon, and Olivia's twin children of Uldren and Orpheus being the viewpoint characters of the story. With Uldren being Maribel's oldest closest friend, lover, and leader of Maribel's personal Glinda Knights faction, and Orpheus being a survivor of the Geass cult he had been sold into at birth by his mother and uncle as a showcase of their own loyalty to the crown. Orpheus gained from the cult the power to take on others' appearances, and using it managed to escape from them before joining the anti-Britannia rebel group Peacemark, that secretly supports the operations of all resistances against Britannia, including, in canon, the Black Knights. But Peacemark also happens to secretly be run by Oyagros in his own attempts to subvert the Geass Order, as his murder of his sister to gain power over the family was itself an orchestrated manipulation by them as well, which he fell into, and he wishes to pay his own penance for even being part of it. Oz, because of all of this, is arguably the single most important of the side stories for Code Geass, and ties a lot into the main story to fill in numerous details the main story did not spend time on, such as how malicious the Geass Order is in being this malignant tumor affecting everything in Britannia and outside of it, with intent to fulfill Charles and V2's wish in killing God. And how even if Lelouch had not gotten involved, their plan was eventually going to be doomed to death by a million cuts, as they kept making enemies of more and more people that rallied against them. Oz in its first arc occurs during the time skip between R1 and R2, as said before, and in fact intersects with Callan's efforts to keep the Black Knights alive during that period where Lelouch is brainwashed and back at Ashford, them even supplying Callan the repair parts for her Guren between seasons. The second arc of the story, in turn, runs concurrent to R2, only with the consequence that between its first and second arcs, there is also a time skip that with everything else, is very difficult to reconcile with the official chronology of the timeline.
The timeline.
Timeline? This is no time to argue about time. We don't have the time. What was I saying?
And much like Lost Colors, it gives focus to the aforementioned Knights of the Round Annette to make her the most developed character of those pilots. And even then, it's not that much. But Annette saving Cornelia from Schneisel I mentioned before, yeah, that's an Oz the Reflection retcon that gets focused on explaining how Cornelia survives to be seen at the end of the anime, which was otherwise a plot hole when looked at R2 alone. Unfortunately, I have never found a full translation of the manga. I assume it exists because we have deep summaries of all of it and how it ties into everything, but anyone actually doing fan translations of the full 10 volumes of the storyline? Yeah, no. It's another thing this fandom seems to have never gotten around to despite, like Red Tracks, how important it is to giving context to a lot of essential information, such as the Geass cult's operations, how they got so many victims to indoctrinate, how insidious their infestation and corruption of Britannia is, and how Charles truly does use his own children for his own whims if they can serve a use and exploit them either through manipulation or with the power of his memory-altering Geass, which would put into question how deeply he may have mind-screwed them to do as he says. And if so, then how much of the rest of everything else is directly his and his allies' fault alone, once again in contrast to his own stated goals. But as I described from the backstory, once more the Oz manga is structured around the same three roles of Lelouch, Callan, and Suzaku, only this time with their alignments reversed. Maribel is most overtly the Lelouch XP, with the Callan XP of Aldrin, who is still a noblewoman, standing by her side as her knight and lover, to the point that not only does Maribel attempt to kill her bastard of a sperm donor after her mother and sister's death, she actually does so because this attack on them when she was a child was a copycat killing, done by V2 to cover up his murder of Marianne by making the public think the attacks are a series of terrorist incidents and not a deliberate attack on her and her kids. Hell, this actually goes one layer deeper than that, as Maribel's sister Julia, who Maribel believes dead, she was actually abducted by VV to be part of the Geass Order, where she met and bonded with Orpheus, and died when the two attempted to escape the cult together. Julia's death, consequently acting as Orpheus's key drive to fight Britannia and expose their atrocities, with Julia not just being a Nunnally XP, but a Euphemia one as well to Orpheus' own point-counterpoint relationship to Suzaku. But Orpheus is a Suzaku without any myopia to how the world works. It is in fact Maribel and Aldrin that are more isolated from that reality, but done so because the two of them are being manipulated to fetter out terrorism and resistance the Black Knights Rebellion inspired, thanks to the personal losses Maribel wrongly believes was caused by dissidents and outsiders, instead of their own family members. A misconception that is corrected over the course of the books when all three of them ultimately come to learn the truth, only for Charles to likewise turn his Geass on all of them, wiping Aldrin's memory to separate her from Maribel, while turning Maribel into the malicious Witch of Britannia, a Julius Kingsley-like tyrant who he has rule over Area 24, formerly Spain, with Orpheus likewise brainwashed into service as her knight. Aldrin recovers her own memories and then reorganizes what allies she has to fight against Maribel, trying to save her oldest friend from herself, only for her, like Callan, to ultimately fail. After being freed from their sperm donor's control thanks to coming in contact with Jeremiah's Geass Chancellor, Maribel is racked with guilt from her actions, so wishes to commit suicide by cop at the hands of the woman she loves in penance for what she did while brainwashed. Her actually dying in the same moment Lelouch does as well. Lelouch providing for her the way to receive her penance by understanding her pain, albeit her actual killer being Orpheus himself. For Orpheus seeks to end the lives of all Geass users, and over the course of the story, Maribel herself had become one with the power of puppeteering. all of which are story points from the main series reduxed in that manga, yet executed in more narratively satisfying ways by the side stories writer Shigeru Morita, who on top of doing some of the work on Akito the Exiled, also wrote some episodes of Gundam Seed and Destiny, and was the sole writer of the Seed OVA series Stargazer. He also wrote a chunk of Space Battleship Yamato 2199, and a couple episodes of Lupin III, The Woman Called Fujiko Mine. So, he's gotten around. And thanks to his story, Maribel is canonically the only member of Lelouch's family to side with him by the end. For between them, they mutually understand the sin they wish to absolve that better explains both of their death wishes. The pair entering a mutual pact to obtain absolution by ending their lives in penance. But through such, making sure the atrocities reflected in each other's eyes will never happen again. Which gives them both a more valid reason to go through with it, as between them and those who are pushing them towards the point of no return, they at least have someone that can understand them, and have the comforts of a familiar hand as they leap over the edge. With the Glyndon Knights' confrontation against Maribel aboard Schnizel's Damocles superweapon actually preventing the atrocities Lelouch as the Demon Emperor had claimed he would perform. The threat of them being enough to demonize them both, all as Maribel and Lelouch had planned. This acting to retcon the main ending of the series, so no, Lelouch in the original Canon series never succeeds in committing a genocidal act to take attention off of Nunnally's actions, but the threat that he was, and the fear from it, being what was recorded as their history. Meaning, if Sunrise had ever thought to blend the Demon Emperor was actually Julius Kingsley out they have now thanks to Akito, it would mean a full exoneration of the sins Lelouch was damned under in the endgame of the series.
あなたは食料を独占し民を飢えさせた。私が猪木殿に米を返してもらえるよう頼む。
何度もやりました。
半時して帰ってこなければ結構してくれ。
兄様が猪木を撃ってくださいました。これより神楽木ディボースキが豆腐の大殿です。
故に王の座を追われ私が大殿となったのです。
お前が奪ったのは
猪木殿、まさか毒を。
最後に頼みだ。それがお前のなすべきことだ。バカ正直に聞いていればいいものを。裏切り者め。
あなたは自ら死を選んだのです。しかし私を裏切り者とおっしゃいました。
Frankly, from everything I've read from the summaries, Oz the Reflection pushes the redo button hard on the later parts of the main Code Geass story, but done in ways that is for the most part more functional as it removes the baggage and narrative problems R2 has. Hell, most of the story of Oz is from the point of view of the aforementioned Aldrin, to not just make her the Callan equivalent, but the confirmed deuteragonist alongside Maribel. Hell, they're echoing that fact that she's the Callan XP so strongly that her signature nightmare is a red model Lancelot known as the Grail. And Oz even ends with Aldrin forming a new version of the Glyndon Knights alongside Nanette as a counterpoint to the Black Knights, as they don't trust the Black Knights under Suzaku to not screw everything up. And also in memorial to who Maribel was before she was brainwashed. There's a lot more to the events of Oz than make it a story worth your time I don't want to get into here, but it's unfortunately a lot, and I wish someone had gone after translating it as it deserves proper exposure to audiences outside of Japan as a story of what could have been, had the main series itself been properly executed to produce the tragedy the staff wanted. As from all these synopses, it does feel like a proper tragedy with appropriate closure to it, instead of something that generates the infuriated ire that R2 does. Mainly because in Oz, the characters don't come off as being stupid. Another one that's received some decent fanfare is the manga LancelotXGuren, set involving side stories during the events of the early side of R2. The Guren side of the manga has especially received praise, thanks to its introduction of Benio, the youngest member of the Black Knights, who joined them amidst their exodus from Japan, who is taken under Callan's wing due to Benio's piloting ability potentially coming to rival her own, with the two developing a big and little sister dynamic between them, which shows just a different way we were sort of robbed of the main series. For Benio, comes off as another Nunnally XP, except without Nunnally's disabilities and matching the capabilities Nunnally herself shows as a Knightmare pilot in the Knightmare manga. She thus comes to represent a version of Nunnally who may have come to agree with and join her brother's crusade, and Callan's protectiveness of Benio, a reflection she and Nunnally might have had in those circumstances, while once more reestablishing that Callan was the intended paramour, as even this side of the manga lays on thick Callan's affections for the man, which even the Black Knights the pair don't regularly interact with can see clear as day. The biggest issue with the LancelotXGuren manga is it's another one of the side stories that occurs in a time period where there just is not enough time shown happening in the original series to permit their events to happen, just sheerly due to the time crunch the storyline is presented as being under by that point. Moreover, it even further reinforces how ridiculous the betrayal plot becomes due to more examples showcasing how Lelouch delegated authority to other individuals and never hoarded it all under solely himself, which was one of the contingent things by which the Black Knights were tricked into betraying him. Lastly, something else important to address is the series Lelouch of the Rebellion RE. And matching how Code Geass draws some inspiration from Gundam Wing, Rebellion RE is the Code Geass equivalent to Gundam Wing's manga Glory of the Losers, a retelling and re-adaptation of the series that expands upon and fleshes out the story and plot points of the series in a way to more concisely resolve them without the narrative issues R2 caused. However, it in turn, like the original manga, has its own set of issues, primarily with how it ties into another manga series called Renya of the Darkness that is set in the mid-1800s and chronicles another of CC's contracts with the Britannia family, which quantifies how said witch has been using the royal family for her own whims for centuries, which of course once again makes her dynamic with Lelouch all the worse. And Rebellion RE itself is an entire mess I don't want to get into because, once again, I can't find translations of it, so I'm largely unaware of the specific changes that story makes. But without heavy revisions to R2, I don't see it pulling the same hat-trick Glory of the Losers pulled in fixing the problem areas of Gundam Wing, that ironically were primarily caused by Sunrise mandating that major story elements be shoved out of the main series and into supplementary material. Once more, this isn't a new problem with Sunrise series. Code Geass is just the worst victim of it. But what all of these ultimately show is, while attempts to clean up the mess of the main anime and leave it in better terms were made, as there was severe pushback to what was done, it seemed like there was just no future for the series. At least not in a way that would resolve things in a better way than they had been, or allow for stories to be told past the point of the Zero Requiem in the canonical story, as it was impossible to do so without addressing the mistreatment and scapegoating of Lelouch himself that had been recognized by the audience, and to properly settle affairs with his loved ones. So a lot of us were just content with the side stories we got. And for us in the West, there was always that hope that we could at some point get the supplementary material properly imported, to show to other fans that weren't in the know, hey, this material doesn't fix everything, but it clarifies some things that were wrong. And then for the 10th anniversary, Sunrise seemed to forget all of that baggage when the compilation movies happened, and it didn't just throw away all of the patch fixes the side stories and supplementary material provided by completely and utterly disregarding them. Oh no, it basically destroyed all merit to the franchise with how it messed things up further to create Sunrise's own ideal version of the story, and dangled them actually bringing Lelouch back from the dead to reconcile with and fix everyone's screw-ups, before revealing the middle finger that no, that wasn't what they were doing, nor were they taking advantage of the out that Akito and Oz had permitted them either to exonerate Lelouch as the Demon Emperor. They were in fact retconning the entire series in such a way that not a single thing in the goddamn story worked anymore, with what was excised from the narrative or outright rewritten in the new movie continuity of Code Geass. And yes, that was supposed to be the selling point of the movie continuity. Ichiro Okuchi and Goro Taniguchi outright said it was its own separate canon, divorced from the original, created at the insistence of Sunrise, making the movie timeline a textbook example of written by committee.
This has made a lot of people very angry and been widely regarded as a bad move.
It, and everything that follows from it, is and will remain non-canon to the original story, did not reflect the events or characterization of the original story, and was not supposed to have messed with or changed anything that the original did. Even though they were diverging from it so heavily, it meant we'd never get several events we wanted to see depicted that would play off of dangling plot threads, character stories, and mistakes that had to be acknowledged about the original to do anything more with the setting.
You maniac! You blew it up! Damn you all to hell!
This is another case where a company doesn't seem to know their audience, and is often not self-aware of the problems with their own works by which to fix prevalent issues, or at the very least, not compound the error again. And I think the side stories did all of that work to try to mend the failings of R2, within making generally engaging content for them to take advantage of, so they could course-correct the problems, only for those overtures to be ignored.
あの時はずっと待っていた。
覚悟はできてるよ。
信じていたものを裏切った気分はどうだ?
As a result, Code Geass's compilation movies and their direct sequel, Lelouch of the Resurrection, are on the short list of the worst movies for a franchise Sunrise has ever made. They butcher the longer, successful narrative elements and characterization in order to speedrun through it all just to emphasize and exalt only minor changes as the most important elements of the story. Even though these divergences either majorly conflict with the narrative events from the original, which the movies insist on repeating, or are reinterpreting, disrespect the characters involved by doing them, or are ones that easily could have been done without the need to change anything. And even both of these are likewise in conflict with when they are used, as they are commonly not done where they should be. Worst of these is this reinterpretation is done for the purpose of presenting Lelouch at his worst and most selfish, absent entirely of the positive character traits and altruistic reasonings that are his core motivations, that he just disguised under more petty ones. So in the end, not a single character in the compilation movies is treated right, and only conforms to the absolute most shallow reading possible of the series that lacks all the nuances that made the show work and be engaging as it was, even at its most frustrating in R2. As if it were all to say, really? This is the guy you want back? Don't you want some other person to follow than Lelouch? As we want his story to have ended, so now we'll make it so you want his story to have ended and he can be pushed off to the side. Now that admittedly is a gross exaggeration on my part, but is still the sentiment conveyed from a statement Goro Taniguchi himself made. As far as he and Okuchi were concerned, they were adamant in wanting to keep Lelouch dead and out of the picture. And if anything more was to be done with the setting, then it would have to be with anyone else but Lelouch. But as I said, the baggage from the ending, not having the proper closure, effectively prevented such. The inability for the Akito series to gain traction without him involved ultimately proved that, as well as any positively received side story still revolving around the dynamics of him and Callan, with Suzaku as their enemy. And the Resurrection movie, Well, it got people in seats because people wanted to see how Lelouch would be revived, reunited with his loved ones, and exonerated. But then that audience left. Permanently. While its earnings end up conflated with those of the compilation movies that preceded prior to its release in 2019, the numbers I read had Resurrection earn 1 billion yen in its Japanese theatrical run, roughly equivalent to $8 million, give or take whatever the yen-to-dollar conversion rate was at the time, which is what is recorded on the website Box Office Mojo. Over 2 million of that from its opening weekend, but it was only in theaters for a month before audiences stopped going to see it and Sunrise pulled the film. And from looking up other films to compare, the theatrical release of a movie in Japan normally gets pulled when it stops making above the equivalent of $400,000 or $500,000 on weekends. Give or take weekday attendance, or if the movie was, say, a limited theatrical run that had a set date to stop being shown. And again, Resurrection reached that point by its 3rd weekend, indicating that it did flop. To add some points of comparison, and only using Japanese-originating films in doing so, Gridman Universe in 2023 had a 14-week run, through which it earned just short of $5 million. It was not as financially successful as Resurrection was, yes, but it lasted longer because the Gridman movie had lower week-to-week drops in attendance, whereas Resurrection saw huge week-to-week drops in attendance. Thus, theaters it was showed in kept it around longer before the movie got pulled. And some weeks the movie was shown, it actually saw a rise in attendance and earnings overall. But despite how I like the Gridman series Studio Trigger made, they're not exactly the biggest audience pull with a large and rabid fan base. Gridman from its start was always going to be a niche film, so that it lasted that long in theaters is itself telling on how popular it was, as the nostalgia and fan demand for it was not that deep to get larger numbers than that. Similarly, Gundam 00 Awakening of the Trailblazer in 2010 made $9.2 million, with its opening weekend making $2.2 million of that, both of these being stronger numbers than Resurrection. And Trailblazer itself lasted twice as long in theaters as Resurrection did, with the news that the film was getting pulled resulting in its last weekend having a 238% increase in attendance. Just about 2 months in theaters? Yeah, that's the normal run for a movie in Japan, and its week-to-week drops were not that steep. So this is pretty much in line with expectations for a popular movie. Hell, Trailblazer was more financially successful than Resurrection was in just 2010 money. Adjusted to 2018 numbers, its earnings equate to well over $10 million. And this pattern continues as shown by Hideaki Anno's Shin Kamen Rider film in 2023, which ran for 7 weeks itself, to an earning of $15.4 million with consistent week-to-week attendance. Gundam Hathaway's Flash in 2021 had an 8-week theatrical run itself, and earned just short of $19 million before the same thing happened. Dragon Ball Super, Broly, lasted 8 weeks in 2019 to an earnings of $34.6 million. The critically acclaimed Godzilla Minus One ran for 10 weeks and earned $36 million domestic in Japan. One Piece film Red, again bringing us back to the beginning of all this, was directed by Goro Taniguchi, and it was a very popular film, resulting in it lasting in theaters for 26 weeks. To a domestic yield of $136 million. And to put into comparison the most extreme outlier one possibly could, the Demon Slayer movie Mugen Train, first released in 2020 in the middle of the pandemic, but it earned just short of $365 million domestic after running for 31 consecutive weeks. Yeah, they literally could not get that movie out of theaters. Like, just limiting my sampling to just 2019 Japanese theatrical releases, and again, not counting limited theatrical runs, the only ones I was finding that had as short a run because people stopped going to see it was the movies that tied into Kamen Rider Z.O., the Heisei Generations Forever film lasting that same length of a month in theaters. But even that abomination made $12.5 million, and that film is a noted disaster only buoyed up by the past actor cameos for the franchise as it was an anniversary film, in the same way Resurrection was. And then you compare it to something like, say, Gundam Seed Freedom, which released in January of this year, and it made 1 billion yen in just 3 days. The same amount Resurrection got in its theatrical run, Seed Freedom earned in solely its opening weekend, and more than doubled that amount to become the most financially successful film Sunrise ever made in just the first full 2 weeks after its theatrical distribution. And it was a film whose production had been delayed since 2006. Seed audiences waited through nearly 20 years and the death of head writer Chiaki Murasawa to finally see that film get done. And it was widely accepted by Seed fans because, unlike Resurrection, it gave the Seed audience what it actually wanted from a Seed sequel movie. It's the same for Spy Family Code White, which was written by Ichiro Okuchi as well, which hit 6.4 billion yen itself in earnings, roughly $44 million US, as of it being in theaters for 6 weeks. Again, at the time of recording this, where that is true. It's likely still stuck around in theaters and earned more than that. And my point with these comparisons is, it is possible for a film to make money, but not be well regarded by the audience for it. Regardless of how much the film made in the weeks it was in theaters, the reception of the film tends to define how long it goes on to run for in Japan, and thus how much it can make over time. Films can be hyped or have a very rabid fan base present a very strong initial showing. But if they or the general audience are not accepting of it, then its attendance is going to crater hard and fast as word of mouth gets around, with movies that flop getting pulled and replaced quickly, and in this case, a month. And from what information I could find, Resurrection had very steep week-to-week drops, which is why it got pulled. No major number of people were going to see it once information about its contents got out. Whereas, for, say, the Gridman example, it might have not been the most popular thing ever, but its attendance was consistent instead of dropping like a stone because people who saw it liked it and recommended others go see it. The same is currently happening as I record this with Seed Freedom. It is not showing large week-to-week drops in attendance. It's more coasting down like you see more popular movies, so it is successful already beyond the money it has made. Resurrection did not show this. Now, this does not represent every factor behind that, but generally that is the pattern you see from these numbers. And again, considering what every fan of the franchise wanted out of the movie timeline, yeah, this tracks with what happens when an audience rejects a production. Hell, the same thing happened in America with the DC Extended Universe movies. They were highly hyped by proponents of them and fans of the source material, so they saw high attendance at opening, but were almost immediately followed by steep week-to-week drop-offs as fans and general audiences were not accepting of those films. Thus, in the movie Code Geass Reviews of the Resurrection, following the messed up depiction of the story in the prior 3 compilation films, a Middle Eastern nation is unhappy with peace being finally brought to the world because their entire population is a bunch of mercenaries. And I'm not even going to touch on how that makes no sense. This production is already too long as it is. I'll only say that a kingdom needs more than one primary job type to have any form of proper infrastructure. Like, I don't even know who they were trying to use as a real-world allegory to in this case. But this shows how unsustainable the current peace in the world is and how weak its protectors of such in fact are, because it is a peace that is only being sustained through force and oppression if they cannot deal with such an easy-to-resolve issue. As the people in charge of the Black Knights are not those who can open dialogues between people, which thus defeats the entire purpose of the Zero Requiem, as the Black Knights are only now causing more conflicts. These events likewise presenting Suzaku, as fans had long stated and writers for all the side stories had long showcased, as completely incapable of his duties in leading the Black Knights to maintain the peace, as he only knows how to subjugate and hold power, not in any way negotiate or reason out means by which to resolve problems, which had only bred deeper and deeper animosity between the nations, which are now being exploited or screwed over because he's not doing his job. And as a consequence, Nunnally, who had abdicated the job left to her by Lelouch's death, is abducted, again, as a bargaining chip through which to call out the United Federation of Nations' own hypocrisy and corruption within just a freaking year. The movie says 2 years have passed since Lelouch's death, but the film is set in the middle of 2019. That the entire system Lelouch made to bring about peace is already on the verge of failure and collapse, because no one he handed that job to can actually do it! And worse, the leader of this nation, Shamna, has her own Geass, which makes what forces that are able to be scrounged up unable to beat her, as her Geass allows her to send her consciousness back in time to counter any obstruction her forces face thanks to future knowledge, which summarily ended up justifying literally every time travel fix-the-story fanfic fans of this franchise have ever made up for it. And trust me, after R2, Fix-It fanfics, whether they use time travel or not, made up such a high percentage of actively developed fanfiction related to this franchise, it almost became its own subgenre.
Hoochie needs to be louder, angrier, and have access to a time machine.
Regardless, she wants to use Nunnally's own regrets in tandem with the power of the last operational thought elevator to expand her powers so she can go back far enough to circumvent Lelouch's sacrifice and restore the prior world order, unaware and uncaring of Charles and Schneisel's own respective plans for genocide. And why Nunnally specifically for this? That is not explained, though it is believed to be for similar reasons as why Charles needed Nunnally in the Knightmare manga. Except the reason that worked was because the specific Geass Nunnally got in that story. There is no reason for that presented in this film. Unknowing of this, Callan is sent into the country to save Nunnally, and ends up encountering CC, who has a mind-wiped yet living Lelouch with her, as the movies attempt to answer horribly the question of whether Lelouch got a code and became immortal when he defeated his bastard of a sperm donor. And despite trying to exploit that possible story point, they don't actually answer the question, making all matters around it worse because they continued the needless ambiguity over the matter.
長生きは本当にいいものか好きで不死身になったわけじゃない。
誰もが死に苦しめられてる。私は医師として何度もその無念に立ち会ってきた。
死なないって生きてるって言えるのかな。
The only way there seemingly is to resolve this mounting conflict is to restore Lelouch back to himself, though it is never explained inside of the movie itself why CC brought Lelouch here, because there were other more accessible points she could have used to help Lelouch recover. CC canonically knows the location of several other thought elevators that are not present in an active war zone. The most relevant one being the one that is literally off the coast of Japan. And I cannot remember a single line in the films that even pretends to explain why the most easily accessible of the thought elevators to this from is not the one actually fucking used to do this long before this film's events. And it's not. If you only have the movie, that is a plot hole. Its explanation was listed in a supplementary pamphlet that came with the movie in Japan, which the movie assumes you read as opposed to supplying the answer to why in the movie itself. And for the people in the West, yeah, when Funimation imported the film, that booklet was not included. Instead of that, in this, we got postcards! From what I read, not every theater in Japan that showed the movie got those pamphlets either, leading to audiences being blind to what basis the film was even operating under, why certain characters were in the positions they were now, how the political landscape of the planet had changed, and how even in the movie timeline, Callan was still head over heels for Lelouch, as if the movie was actually going to bother to resolve anything between them, only for it to pull a Sunrise-mandated bait-and-switch. And without that book, just from what's solely in the movie, it makes the entire plot of the film end up being one massive series of narrative contrivances, as opposed to the result of a series of logical actions a character might perform in the situation they're thrust in. such contrivances have broken better movies. And while the booklet explains some things, it doesn't justify the series of events we see occur or the actions taken within them. Or in simpler terms, because the actions we see in just the film are done without presenting explicable internal logic or reason, that the series, which started out really, really smart, has now devolved into being driven by an idiot plot. This is further shown by how the second Lelouch recovers his mind, the film just turns on God mode for the guy and how his tactical genius is taken to a level that the main series had originally nerfed him of in order to beat someone with the literal power of time travel, alongside new weapons and means of doing things that should not be possible in the setting anymore, but they just conveniently forgot that to be the case. Like, up until this point with the franchise, I had really liked the Knightmares for how sleek and agile they were. Fast-paced, frenetic, and personal, with focus constantly placed in the best strategic use of the army, using them outside of the specialist ace pilots who could be allowed to run wild. Or in Lelouch and Callan's case, directed to be the scalpel that severed the Achilles tendons of the charging enemy force. The rapid tech development and new options to do things like energy weapons and flight packs and the energy wings over time, I genuinely didn't mind them, as they fit the standard expectations of a lensman's arms race, escalating things through experimental tech development that is a common trope for these sorts of series. Hell, I consider the Guren Satan 8 Elements one of the best-looking mechs in existence, it only missing a function to turn its Radiant Rave Surger arm into a normal hand to fight with any other weapon plausible, or possibly steal the enemies. But in the original series, amidst stopping Schneisel, Nunnally, and the Black Knights, Lelouch destroyed the Securitite mine of Japan. No Securitite? Yeah, no superconductors through which to use as a means of creating new mecha to pilot. Now, feasibly, you could find more veins, but when 90% of it was written as existing in solely one place that had literally been obliterated, so there was no more access to the material from it, and that event is still kept in the movie timeline, yeah, it's not going to be used wastefully in war again. But then you get to Resurrection, and on top of the film just straight up ignoring this, every element of the prior aesthetic with which made such designs functional is just gone. I literally hate every new mech that is introduced in the film. They are all worse than ones we previously had in not just aesthetic, but actual capabilities than their predecessors, with exception to one no one in any way, shape, or form wanted. They've all devolved into looking like heavy, wide-bodied bruisers that require exterior armor and hyper-heavy weapons to even do jack, in a setting where they no longer have the resources to just be so wasteful within these units. And that elegance in the agility which previously made these designs appealing is just completely lost. Not to mention how their weapons and utilities seem to have gotten even worse, not better. The entire appeal of the Radiant Wave Surger as a weapon is one touch or you get stuck in the range of its blasts and you're dead. It's a low energy use, one shot, one kill weapon that Callan makes amazing use of. And it only gains more capabilities and utility as things go on, to the point that in the final battles of the series, she becomes an outright one-woman army. In the movie, the successor Guren-type special, however, is armed with just an energy drill version of the Radiant Rave Surger when it is not using an external armor unit. And she has no other weapons or increased utility from the Wave Surger that the Guren Satan had as its standard package. It is in every way worse than the previous version of the mech. And not only is it just not the same, not only is the Radiant Wave Drill attack actually just a rip-off version of the backup emergency weapon the Lancelot prototype club uses, so the attack isn't even original or suddenly a super powerful exclusive to the unit. The type special then resultantly has less armaments and utility than pretty much everything else, including the previous versions of the Guren, with it officially in the tech specs having 15% less operating time in battle than the Gurren Seitan has because its battery life is worse. It is quite literally the least power-efficient version of the Gurren, in a setting where resource scarcity should require it increase its operational time, not dropping it because, well, the Gurren can get resupplied now. The Gurren not being able to be resupplied when supplies for it were available has been used against Callan in the past. That is the entire complaint against how she was screwed over in R2! Operational time limits have time and again been used to screw Callan over and make her lose battles she otherwise would have won. Technological advancement like that is supposed to make things more efficient and more diverse in their capabilities, not shorter and less capable. If it was a unit versus unit battle, the Seitan can literally fly circles around the type special and not even need to attack it, as it just successfully outlasts it. So it once more cripples the best pilot in the franchise with respect to everyone else. And for no explicable reason, as any competent designer should know to fix limitations in their prior designs. And before the movies, the Gurren's creator, Rakshata, did. So it's not just a slight against the Gurren Seitan or units of Callan's, but defamation of Rakshata's character, as well to make her creations worse than the previous ones. Even if she had a grievance with who upgraded the Gurren into the Seitan. That person being the Lancelot's creator Lloyd, that she cannot stand, and the two are presented as having a deep, visceral rivalry between them. But if she has problems with how the Seitan's upgrades were handled, she would have improved on them herself to show Lloyd his inferiority. That is how their dynamic works. But she wouldn't scrap the Seitan only to build something that was worse than it in every single way, as that would only prove Lloyd better than her. And that's especially bad in comparison to how Suzaku's Lancelot Sin is given the fucking glory treatment all over again. Despite in the universe and the tech specs for it, it is treated as a unit no one the world over wants to see again and was officially banned from development. Made worse in this comparison of the two, that shoulder pauldron on its side is even an active external battery attachment, doubling its operation time, which addresses the one thing the Gurren type special had as a brand new hindrance which shouldn't exist that the Lancelot does not. The Gurren Seitan can beat the Lancelot Albion like a drum all day if it were to fight a Suzaku that didn't have the live command boosting its stats. But the type special is so trash, it's not even a fucking contest that it'd get razed to the ground if the cast didn't have on God mode by this point. It is just done so wrongly. And don't even get me started on the garbage that is the Gakkoke, Lelouch's new unit that is inferior to even his first ace unit, the Gawain, which was the first flight-capable unit in the franchise at all, with the Gawain bearing mass wide-range destruction attacks. Or the Shinichiro, which replaced it in R2, which traded some of the heavy assault armaments for more utility weapons and a super strong defensive barrier, alongside the ability to hit multiple targets at once. A single focused movable laser, which is the Gakkoke's primary weapon. Yeah, not only is that worse than the Gawain's mass destruction capabilities, it also doesn't beat calculated beam spam the Shinichiro provides that can't be countered easily due to the refraction of the shots. And the continuous beam from its attack, while being similar to one the Shinichiro could also fire, is a much higher drain on resources than either what the Gawain or Shinichiro's weapons utilized. So it again suffers from the problem that its operational time is the worst of the three. And considering the amount of forces that get scrounged up to fight them in the climax of the movie, yeah, no. This is not the mark of dominance and righteousness it's shown as, but them succeeding when they should, by all respects, be failing. Especially since this is some of the single worst animation Goro Taniguchi has ever done. All of the elegance of the mecha brawls in the main series, and the intuitive and fluid fast-paced use of cel-shaded CGI in the Akito OVAs, yeah, that's completely absent here. In Resurrection, the mecha don't just look and are armed like uncultured, bruising brutes. They move like them as well due to how horribly the CGI models for these mecha are. I have seen some badly animated CG mecha in my time, but this is just plain embarrassing. As I saw a better CGI mecha from the Zoid series produced by Studio Zebek 25 years ago! And Sunrise has less of an excuse for this, as both the Gundam Unicorn OVA series and Cross-Ange Rondo of Angels and Dragons made excellent use of CGI mecha animation. But that isn't present here at all, despite Resurrection coming a half-decade after those series. Hell, I feel like I did a better job of designing a successor to the Satan when I kitbashed the Testament Gundam Master Grade a couple years ago for a contest. So these units based on being big and beefy, with super powerful new moves completely abandoning the showcase of speed, agility, and skill that prior fights were more reliant on? Yeah, no, they're a complete trash fire presented as inferior to what we've already seen in every possible way. It's the Mobile Suit Gundam Heavy Weapons Armor platform problem all over again, where inclusion of all that new equipment just makes the unit worse and less functional. Like, it's not even just them. I hate the design of everything in the movie. Not just the mecha, but the casual clothing and revised uniforms for the cast, where completely and utterly is form over function, and yet the form is not in any way aesthetically pleasing. It's not exactly a case of, they changed it, now it sucks. It's a case of, these things had a reason to be this way before, and the movie version in no way follows from that thought process. Callan's previous flight suit had protective padding to prevent her from being injured due to the Gurren's irregular control scheme. Where is that this time? Or was it more important to point a chevron down at her boobs? 'Cause, as discussed before, no one at Sunrise seemed to really consider the well-being of the characters with all this. And again, not just her. The redesigned Zero outfit also sucks because it loses the color balance provided by the contrasting color trim. You know, something that's done in most better Toku hero costumes that the Zero identity was drawing creative basis from. The film is also heavily an excuse for characters to show their own guilt and regrets over being conned by Schneisel on the Black Knight's behalf. Much of which almost seems directly inspired by fanfiction as, yeah, I've seen such played out exactly like this in fanfiction years before this. Only the fanfiction seemed to do it better. And to a lesser extent, a final reconciliation between Lelouch, Cornelia, and Nunnally. But it's most centrally lacking many of the scenes and discussion fans wanted from such an event to validate them. All to push a very contrived and unearned ending where Lelouch will leave them all again, so reconciliation this shallow does not seem to matter. Particularly in this pertaining to the absence of the previously seen dynamic between Callan and Lelouch that had long defined their depiction, character, and arc, but had been excised from the movies despite it being a byline through everything necessary to the base story. Even and especially because the movie handout pamphlet pays special attention to note Callan's continued affection for him. So you'd think, since this is specifically being pointed out, that such would be a major plot point in the film, and would actually spend some time allowing the two to talk out their feelings to resolve the issue. Whether, after all that's happened, they're even right for each other, or if they should part as friends as the world just won't them be together. For that would have been the mature, adult way to handle such, both between the writers writing it and the characters actually discussing it. To let them, and the audience that was previously beat over the head that there was something between them, have the closure they should have had a decade ago. And yet, the movie continues to not let fans even have that. So nothing it was intended to close out with anyone between them actually is allowed to happen. Instead, making Lelouch act as even more of a condescending jerk towards her and others, because Sunrise once more refused to let them actually settle things appropriately. This thus consequently being the second of the 3 times Okuchi has had Sunrise screw over his shipping, where they vetoed even letting them settle the matter. And you only get context to how badly that was handled from outside the media itself. Like, a lot of the manga can get away with that because they go AU and have different story focuses. But since the movie timeline was a direct abridged retelling of the main storyline that insists that all the original events happened with only minor changes in the movie's focus, yeah, that does not fly. And I know I've wrapped a lot of my discussion around the dynamic these two bear, in part because of all the additional material that does make overt how much they were shipped together, so of course I'm going to ship them too. However, I'm one of those fans that would have been fine with the two of them not getting together. Really. But my caveat to that is, they needed to be allowed to talk things out, and not continued to mistreat them even into this movie. For this needed to be settled to permit Sunrise to do what they wanted, but Sunrise refused to let them do it. And you cannot tell me, well, they just didn't have the time for them to do that due to the threat they faced, as might be the defense raised for how short they and anyone else Lelouch has such moments with in the film are. For here's the thing about Resurrection. It's a movie that has less than 2 hours to its total runtime, and yet an hour of it is wasted thanks to this same dragged-out fight scene that becomes less interesting the longer it goes on. And the length of that fight scene is why we don't get the moments and addressing the situations we needed to close out the storyline properly. The antagonist of the film, Shamna, is manipulating time by this point to try and avoid the inevitable defeat that is coming. So the same fights just keep repeating themselves with little uninteresting variations to them, which bleeds all tension and makes the entire event more and more boring as nothing of value comes from these repetitions. Even her showcase to have rebuilt Charles's Sword of Akasha to permit her manipulations of time like this by controlling the collective unconsciousness does not actually improve Shamna's stake, as she is an uninteresting villain. And yes, for those confused about that statement, that holistical structure in the collective unconsciousness, that's not supposed to be the unconsciousness. That's the weapon meant to kill it and take control of it. And the movie timeline seems to have completely confused this point. If it was meant to be the unconsciousness itself the entire time, then any time we see inside of the thought elevators throughout the series, it should have been there. It's not. That it only shows up once Charles and V2 complete the weapon meant to attack God means that the structure is the metaphysical representation of the weapon itself. Once more contradicting the Apocrypha's assertion that Lelouch broke the entire collective unconsciousness in requesting that the weapon itself be destroyed. And in the movie timeline itself, it shows that the unconsciousness itself failed to destroy the weapon that would be used against it as required it to fulfill Lelouch's Geass-induced request. That is a major narrative failure, not a character originating one as it is so blamed. As outside of the fight, like I said, Shamna and her compatriots' motivations are shallow, uninteresting, and not thought out. They are excuse plot villains we are given no reason to care about, and are largely irrelevant to what was. So that they take up so much of the film without actually adding anything meaningful to it just makes the focus on them all the more irritating. It is an absolute amount of nothing that the film's time is utterly wasted on, over anything else of actual value. What we cared about seeing settled really was the cast addressing their mistreatment and mishandling, with the only way to deal with such being actually giving and committing tangible time to the showcase of resolving their issues. But by the film being overwhelmingly focused on Shamna and her cohort's actions over anything else, we again don't even get more than lip service that doesn't reflect actual resolution. After Lelouch gets his mind back, he and Callan don't spend more than 2 sentences talking to each other. They have no on-screen opportunity to settle anything between them. And after the franchise spent a decade saying they could have been together had things been different and he'd not martyred himself, and everything is different now, that was something that needed to be done. This doing nothing but join the pattern of Callan's mistreatment in Code Geass's narrative for Lelouch to be even more of an asshole to her, and deny her even talking with the one she has affections for long enough for them to decide to part as friends. Callan spends more time arguing with CC in the film than she's permitted to talk with Lelouch. That is a disservice to them both. And if they weren't going to be together, whether Sunrise, Goro Taniguchi, or even Ichiro Okuchi himself was responsible for that decision, for such to be accepted after so long of telling people that they were supposed to be, this needed to be settled. For fuck's sake, they gave that lip service to Lelouch and Shirley's relationship in the movie timeline, so they were more than aware that was something that had to be done, and because they didn't, the film entirely lacks closure for anything between them or any of the other characters that should have resulted, showing once again their seeming contempt for the audience and appearing to dangle resolutions only to yank them away. It's no wonder the film flopped as a result. And that's not even getting into what's done with Suzaku to once again make him be regarded as the worst character in the franchise. I say, without hyperbole, that this fucking scene, is what broke the film for me. And I've heard it did for others as well, where they walked out at this point. This is a scene where Suzaku, after being rescued, just attacks and pummels and beats up Lelouch again, proclaiming that the world's going wrong again, not because of Suzaku's own failure at doing anything to stop conflicts, as he only knows how to beat things up and can't consider anyone else's perspective but his own as legitimate, thus cannot stop the conflicts that arise from legitimate grievances, but solely because of Lelouch escaping the punishment for his sins yet again. Sins, I will remind you, that the expanded media has done everything to exonerate him of, and the others, everyone else is just as, if not more, guilty of. Suzaku is crying out about the anguish Lelouch has put everyone through, perceivable in this moment as a metatextual narrative XP of an audience's view of thus being yanked around regarding whether he lived or not for a decade, only to come back out of the blue. And yet, it is so fucking hollow, as it's not about being angry at Lelouch, but it's Suzaku projecting again, making it all about himself again, and his refusal to ever admit he was in the wrong, like everyone else does! As if everything Suzaku screwed up after he killed Lelouch was somehow still Lelouch's fault. I literally saw red when I saw this contemptible hypocrite and moral coward that ruined every better option have the gall to tell off the only person that ever did anything that had the slightest chance of making people's lives better, even as especially after he had failed in the one job he'd taken for himself in the aftermath. Suzaku thus, as opposed to representing the audience in that moment, instead represents Sunrise's frustration itself in the need to keep bringing back Lelouch, all because both the company and creators wanted his story to be done with, and was berating him for the audience still caring about him so deeply it overrode everything else they tried to do. But that's the thing. We care about stories because of the characters within them. If you do wrong by the characters to service the story, then it's a bad story, and people will want it to be changed. Western comic books have had that with bad creative decisions all the time, screwing over fan-favorite characters just to service awful, awful plots. And the public outcry by their reader base leads them to be walked back. And when you think about why they did the movie timeline to begin with, which was to permit them to tell more stories in the setting, this should have been no different. Settle the audience's grievances, and then you could move forward. But this also acted as the sign that neither the creative staff nor Sunrise itself were ever going to acknowledge nor fix what was wrong with Suzaku or the greater series, which is one of the fundamental things that one needs to do in an anniversary event like the movie was. The need to tie up the dangling loose story threads and show people have completed arcs where they have changed, acknowledge their need to change, or express regrets that show self-awareness about what they can't change. But instead, all that was showcased was examples of them only paying the bare minimum of lip service with the most mild of grievances, and doubling down on all the setting-breaking ones. Like, for fuck's sake, Seed Freedom did all of this with Shin Asuka, where he got his redemption arc completed by showing regret for his actions and bullheadedness in Seed Destiny and resolve to change himself, and was succeeding. And again, that movie was originally plotted in 2006 for it to know this. And this scene, This fucking scene is the sole evidence you really need to show that the movie was not being handled in good faith. As no one wanted this. Nor does it show respect to the cast in doing so. It instead doubles down on everything fans had grievances with before. Some could say the movie just ended up far too overhyped after the utter disaster was the compilation films of the movie timeline. But it really does more seem to be a case that the creators for it and Sunrise in general just are not aware of the problems time, reflection upon, and analysis of the series have brought to the forefront, which are all tied to Lelouch constantly being scapegoated for everything and not being allowed to be with those he most values after him having to take the hard road through everything. And yet, that is what the movie does. It is just more of the same of what was disliked before. And yes, that is what the movie is doing all over again. In Apocrypha material made for the movie, it is explained why everything is going wrong, and they blame it all on Lelouch again, which is the last thing we wanted. Then in stopping Charles's attempts to kill God by getting God to intervene and stop him, that somehow Lelouch broke the collective unconsciousness, allowing Charles his claim to divinity by using Lelouch's trapped mind as a medium by which to claim dominion over other souls in the realm. And the time Geass user is unwittingly playing into his scheme through his manipulation of it.
お前たちの時間を巻き戻した。特別な力を手に入れる前の時間に。
Lelouch in this film is thus shown to have failed in his original task of stopping his father. And his failure to even be a martyr through his sacrifice is why the world hasn't changed. Because somehow, the world has become stuck on him, and consequently infested by the ghosts that have leaked out and been trapped in the normal human realm by all the thought elevators going offline to haunt the minds and actions of the living so they cannot move on. And I hate that such somehow describes body thetans, as if this movie wasn't bad enough without referencing the cult that is Scientology in it. And thus, Suzaku beating Lelouch up for helping engineer those events and this threat, even though he wasn't responsible for any of that shit, is supposed to be justified. After CC somehow reconstructs the collective unconsciousness via using Lelouch as a conduit to banish Charles's control. Control that Charles should not have because the collective unconsciousness in the original series erased him and his code from existence since they refused to become part of it. And the consciousness revoked the administrative access granted to him by his code. And even if we're following the movie's train of thought, if Lelouch had been given a code to lead to his revival, then his bastard of a sperm donor should not have had the ability to influence the consciousness either if he was forced to become a part of it. The rules and everything associated with Code Geass' supernatural mythos plot have always been bad and not planned out, and even a bunch of the side stories have rewritten the rules entirely so they can do their own thing with the power set. But before this point, there were at least always rules to keep them consistent. But this throws them all out the window, just to keep a defeated villain in the picture, against all sense, as this is the wrong one to focus one's attention on.
私がここで話した記録は全て消し去ってほしい。私は最悪の王として語り継がれるべきだ。私は多くの民を自らの意志で犠牲にしてきた。宇宙を救うという大義や私への情けで正当化されるようなことは未来永劫あってはならない。
被告人ラクレス・ハスティは有罪死罪とする。だがそれでは足りないと被害者からの嘆願があった。
償いの物語を始めるんだ。
Or, this could actually focus on Suzaku and his inability to solve problems like it's supposed to fucking be. Or Schneizel gets off his leash of control he was put under when he was Geassed in the main series. And the Geass user of the film is just some rando that doesn't understand the powers they're playing with because they can't see past their own nose to realize the problems they're causing for themselves. Would have made sense? The entire setting the movie is placed in doesn't make sense to me. But you would think the ruler of the nation would have some level of competence to possibly think, hey, there never stops being a need for mercenaries, let's just shift our business model to accommodate the current market. Instead of, let's rewind time so the man who was going to take over the world would actually win, and in doing so put us out of business because we won't work with the current market. Like, what is even the hell here? It's why I didn't want to dwell on how imbecilic this nation is. The more you think about it, the less sense it makes.
Doesn't anyone notice this? I feel like I'm taking crazy pills!
Granted, you didn't even need to go that deep into Resurrection to get the feeling something was wrong. I knew things were going to go bad pretty much from the point I saw Tamaki running a successful business. Shinichiro Tamaki is one of the characters I have not talked about yet because I knew I kind of had to consolidate his arc here. He is one of the founding Black Knights from the Kozuki Resistance Cell, and he's a loudmouthed idiot, incapable of doing anything and always getting others in trouble. If he were shown to have an actual skill set he utilized, he'd be considered better than he is. But because he chases glory, he regularly screws himself and others over. One of the most outstanding moments of the series that shows his incompetence is not long after the Black Knight's formation, when Tamaki is given the role of accountant as Lelouch legitimately doesn't know any better after Tamaki volunteered for the job. And Tamaki burns through the Order's entire operational budget throwing parties for the new Black Knights members. These wasteful expenditures exhaust the resources they need to perform their operations and risk collapsing their fight with no effort on Britannia's part, thus requiring Lelouch offer their services to financiers, despite said business conglomerate, known as Kyoto, actually playing both sides against the middle in their own bids for power, despite Lelouch having personal connections to two of the Kyoto members, one of them being the previously discussed Kaguya. Regardless of that, this results in Lelouch having to act further than he needs to ensure the Knights have the resources they need, which is then used against him later when he causes the death of Tatewake Katase, head of the Japanese Liberation Front, which at that point was in the process of being assimilated into the Black Knights without such aggression and attacks. Katase's close friend, Kyoshiro Todoh, who, as mentioned before, Lelouch has a history with, moves to becoming one of the Black Knight's chief generals after Lelouch saves him. But learning from Schneisel in R2 that Katase's death may have been orchestrated by Lelouch is Todoh's berserk button with regards to turning on Lelouch in R2. Of all the bullshit there is around the entire betrayal plot, Todoh's is the sole part of that almost works. If it were not for more backstory stuff tied to Lelouch and Nunnally's time in Japan before it was conquered, which Todoh was part of, that should make Todoh aware of what Lelouch's priorities as a person were, and how much he hates his homeland, that honestly should have permitted him to outright guess it was Lelouch under the mask, without ever needing to confirm it beforehand, as Todoh's the only non-Britannian in the series to ever lead forces to a victory over them. So Todoh's not an idiot to be so easily manipulated as he's shown to be in R2, to get him to play parts in that without hearing Lelouch out first. Once more, my argument with the entire Black Knight's betrayal event isn't that it can't happen at all, or is out of nowhere, but it is handled in the worst ways possible due to how little time is spent on building up their grievances with Lelouch's leadership caused by his lack of trust and detachment. So their eventual actions don't work as intended, whereas had they approached that from alternate avenues, it would have been more functional. But the death of Todoh's friend Katase, or at least Lelouch's part in it, as Katase's death was inevitable regardless of what Lelouch did, would not have been necessary had Tamaki not screwed their finances over. Again, keep this in mind when you're watching R1, that every event in the first season of the series is in some way connected to those that follow it in big and small ways. And the second season and the movie timeline not following from this is what makes them bad. Lelouch spent years fleecing nobles by gambling in chess matches to set up the sheer financial capital to run a private army. has extensive experience balancing financial budgets, not just from the care of himself and his sister, but also doing the accounting for Ashford Academy as part of his student council duties, and has been putting in place everything he'll eventually need to go to war with his sperm donor even before Callan's resistance group entered the picture and crossed paths with him. And Tamaki obliterates all of that in less than a month with his sheer incompetence and financial waste that bankrupts them. And that honestly gets worse if you follow the 3-week model the timeline of the R1 is officially said to go over, as it means Tamaki bankrupted them in literal days. Thus, you honestly, legitimately expect me to believe that Tamaki of all characters would be capable of not only running his own business, but actually doing so well financially that he'd be expanding his operations, opening a second location as a means to reintroduce the former Black Knights members into the movie. Basing it on the visage and iconography of the leader he betrayed is bad enough, but for him to be successfully profiting from defiling that grave, especially as it was made a major plot point that he is as incompetent with finances as he is everything else, is just fucking insulting to anyone who paid attention, as he has no right after what he played part in to claim that it is in tribute and atonement. How the fuck are those that cared for Lelouch not disgusted by him doing that? Yeah, it's not just the Suzaku bullshit or the crap with the shipping. Half the issues with the movies, when you put them in context to what the series actually did, is a source for legitimate grievances. Cause Tamaki's whole spitballing incompetence plot, yeah, every bit of that is not in the films, when that is literally his character, despite what it sets in motion that now has an entire absence of context to it. And if you're not getting my point yet on this, allow me to restate it. Code Geass is not a series that is simple enough to be able to do compilation movies of it. For as much as we complain about R2, there's too many important plot points that come from even its minor events to leave them all out.
では、私は民を守ろうとした英雄。お前はそれを知らずに私から玉座を奪った裏切り者。
ずっと己に問うてきました。少しずつ心を黒く染めたどり着きました。豆腐を救うためには色木殿が全ての汚名をかぶり誰かに玉座を譲る必要があったのです。
王が国のため自ら玉座を捨てたと。
民のためには泥にまみれて手を汚す。あの日私は馬鹿正直を捨て手を汚してでも玉座を奪うべきだった。私は国のために命を捨てたあなたの覚悟を裏切ったのです。
Now, admittedly, the movies do acknowledge some spin-off content of Code Geass that expanded the story with some changes to some scenes, such as in their events retconning in brief appearances of Maribel Mel Britannia into the film timeline, and I could swear the same was done with Rai, and some influences from the side stories are seen periodically through the films, but they are not handled in good faith, what's more conflicting with the presented purpose of them and their actual content. Hell, I don't remember them being mentioned, but I'm pretty sure from the politico-military structure presented in Resurrection, that the Glinda Knights as presented at the end of Oz, who are supposed to remain an anti-terror group focused on counteracting when Suzaku would inevitably fuck up, now don't actually exist anymore despite the movie including the characters that founded them, as they're the ones who should have intervened were an entire nation to go terrorist, especially to both defend and save their former empress. So even if the characters are there, the movie is not using them correctly. But regardless of any side content that may have been alluded to in the movie timeline, with what was cut out of it that was essential to the main story and the arc of the respective characters, and subsequently given zero attention in Resurrection, they basically removed the elements of the story and the dynamics that made R1 work, and in turn made R2's content somehow even worse and be more loathed. For the story of the movie timeline's rendition of the events, well, A no longer went to B, it jumped to D because it assumed you already took and knew B and C, before skipping over to J and bringing it to dance with N while straight up ignoring the interim letters or any signs they existed. Actions no longer had sequential consequences. Effects of actions no longer even pretended to have causes. There was no developing story or evolving character dynamics or a building of relationships there. Just one long sequence of rapidly paced events that gutted representation of story and depiction of character. And it skipped all of that just to get to a new extension to the story that no longer had a valid functioning reason for how it could exist within the setting in the wake of how hack-jobbed together the movie timeline was, and yet still seemed to contradict things further. To continue the chain link metaphor from before, while R2 tangled those chains by connecting them haphazardly or in places they logically shouldn't, which weakened the supports for the greater tale as a consequence due to working backwards from the ending, the movie compilation timeline for Code Geass deliberately snaps the chains in the net, creating massive holes in the structure just to connect two chains that were not previously bonded within said links, one of which that could have been removed from the net entirely without affecting its structure, and the cost of actually doing so affecting the entire structure's integrity so it no longer resembled a net at all, nor did the job in supporting anything. Hell, if I were to give a better example of why the movie canon doesn't work, well, the character Shirley Fennette lives in it, when, as I've alluded to before, her murder is a key event to causing a lot of the things after it, which are all tied to why Zero Requiem comes to happen, and the events part of that plan should not have happened if she is still alive. Like, Super Robot Wars Z2 called this exact thing out a decade ago now, that Shirley dying was the linchpin to all of what happens after. And if she's not dead, then the circumstances that trigger it make even less sense to the point of even further devolving the cast into being mentally handicapped. Once more, for those who have not seen, Shirley is a supporting character throughout the series who is another of Lelouch's love interests, and she is by far the unluckiest character in it. Lelouch and Callan are accidentally responsible for killing her father in a landslide while he was working in an off-the-books secret facility that was in its path, as he was a scientist originally part of the same project that had captured, tortured, and experimented on CC, before Callan's resistance cell saved her. And regardless of what her father did, that affects them. So while Lelouch and Callan have to work through the guilt of killing one of their friend's parents, his death results in Shirley unintentionally helping a woman named Valletta New, who was among the first Lelouch used as Geass on before he figures out his limitations, to out Lelouch's identity as Zero and kill him, but stops herself when she learns Lelouch is Zero, prompting her to attack her co-conspirator instead. Lelouch then wipes her memory of the event and her affections for him to spare her the trauma of her actions, also closing off any potential of a relationship with her as she just can't handle the reality of who he is. This was where the plot with her was originally supposed to end. Lelouch losing someone that could have loved the false fake identity he loathes but cannot deal with the life he lives, but the damage there is done. Valletta survives being shot only thanks to Black Knight Commander Kaname Ogi, who takes her into his home after the incident causes her to develop amnesia, and him not being able to take her to the police due to his membership in the Black Knights, leading to their eventual romance plotline through the rest of the series, when his care for her causes her to develop feelings for him while she is still amnesiac. And to interject, yeah, this is that thing I alluded to earlier where the R1 only occurs over a month thing doesn't work, as the Valletta-Ogi relationship is something big that comes out of the back half of the series. But by that straight, only a month timeline, it means that she'd only have been in Ogi's care for like a week at most. And all of that happened in that time would be so many compressed together events that the two would have literally no time together by which to build any meaningful affection for one another. Code Geass treats this relationship as a wants versus needs conflict. Valletta's time with amnesia showing her that the world she wants is one she is denying herself, because of her Britannian upbringing and because she wants a noble title to ensure her eventual family's prosperity. Thus her affection for Ogi is in conflict with it, leading her to reject him when she recovers, as her upbringing makes her disgusted that she'd be attracted to a number. But if it is not a relationship developed over a much longer time than it has been allowed to be viewed as, then what the relationship is becomes founded upon Stockholm Syndrome, implied sexual assault, and a woman choosing to return to someone who took advantage of her because he was nice to her, which is downright horrible and not what Code Geass treats it as. Such is not a valid interpretation if what develops between them is permitted to occur over a longer period, so it can thus be made clear that what they feel for each other is their informed and educated choice, even though Ogi really should have turned the amnesiac Valletta over to the authorities. Consequences be damned, because his presented excuses for why he doesn't was always a weak one, and then checked up on her to lead to them developing feelings because of that to ground such far better, and not come off to some as him unintentionally indoctrinating her when she is sequestered in his home. Again, those are lines Lelouch does not cross. R1 needs more time to occur over than it is said to have for everything to be justified. Otherwise it becomes a sign of how the story is broken even further due to Valletta later becoming pregnant with Ogi's child late in R2, which has its own level of discomforting connotations with how fast that went, since before that point they would have spent all of, a month officially together after betraying Lelouch. By that point, Valletta has confirmation Ogi has knocked her up.
Justify your existence. What contribution have you made? I've given pleasure to the world because I have such a beautiful ass. That's your case? You need more? Some might say that's a pretty shallow argument. Some might say I'm a pretty shallow guy.
But regardless, in R2, the mind-wiped Shirley develops feelings for Lelouch's false persona again during the useless Ashford plot extension. But in the wake of Jeremiah returning to the storyline with the Geass Chancellor, Shirley's memories are restored, and Rolo, who, as I mentioned before, was a Geass assassin turned to Lelouch's side after he went yandere for his fake brother, then sees Shirley as a threat to Lelouch, so murders her. Lelouch sees it happen, Shirley ultimately dying in his arms, confessing her love of his schoolboy mask to him as he desperately orders her with his Geass to live, and fails. Someone he put his faith in killed someone he valued, and after losing his mother, losing Nunnally to the other side, him being forced to kill Euphemia to spare her from the madness inflicted upon her, and at the time of this occurring, Callan being imprisoned and tortured by Suzaku because of his own failure, it serves as the breaking point in a chain of events that leaves him overwhelmingly racked with guilt, falling into a depression that Callan before this had only just managed to stop him from falling into before, as the weight of his own failures just won't stop crushing him, with no one there to help him bear the burden. And in the following events where Nunnally is then thought to have been killed by Suzaku, after openly betraying whatever remains of the friendship they had left, it's what pushes him over the edge into wanting his own death, which thus serves as the seeds to what became the Zero Requiem plan that has him martyr himself to the world, makes everyone in the world hate him, focus all their anger on him, because at this point he just hates himself and generally believes he deserves to be vilified, and will happily accept their scorn as long as something better results from it. Shirley dying is the root emotional reason he pushes Callan away when the Black Knights betray him and lets them try to kill him, for he legitimately could not take another person who loves him dying in his name. Better he die at others' hand while saving them than at his own after failing to do the same. But if Shirley isn't important, then none of that happens. If she doesn't have reason to help Valletta, the string of events that lead to Black Rebellion failing aren't triggered, nor is Valletta's paramour arc with Ogi that also is a factor to Ogi being the one behind why the Black Knights even let Schneisel talk to and deceive them into betraying Lelouch, as because of his feelings for Valletta, Ogi ends up being the traitor in their midst, enabling all of them to be deceived about how Geass works. Even though Valletta knows how Lelouch's Geass works from her time as one of his handlers, and knows that if Lelouch actually used it on them, then they couldn't get them to betray him. Once again, the reason the Black Knight's betrayal is so condemned is it only happens in the story because those who can provide information or means to subvert it, and have every reason to, don't. Valletta, after she accepts that she's fallen for Ogi of her own free will, has every reason to want to help him achieve his goals, as such are now their goals, even as she's conflicted with regards to her loyalty towards Britannia, who even she eventually admits is just using her. All while Lelouch, when he turns her into a double agent, seems to want to give her everything she emotionally wants that would make her life fulfilling, which is the same way he earned the Black Knight's loyalty. They're working towards common goals that throw off the hypocritical classism of Britannia. Being concerned her paramour is brainwashed, that's legitimate on her end. But her not telling her boyfriend about his boss's powers and what their limitations are so he can watch out for signs he's used them on them, and only tell them that he can control people with no limits to what his powers are, which she knows is not true, that is just enough false information to make Ogi dangerous and potentially cause him to get himself harmed through a reckless need to expose Lelouch that could very well lead to him getting brainwashed if Lelouch were the kind of person to use his power that ruthlessly, under normal circumstances, to his allies. If Valletta actually cared about him as the story hinges such on, she wouldn't allow him to go off half-cocked like that. And yet she does. Once more, because in R2, the effects we see happen need a cause, regardless of how much that cause is out of presented character. To many, because of how this is shown to play out, Ogi is another of the characters in the franchise that is considered ruined by R2. And yet, at the end of the story, they're among the few with happy lives, even married with a newborn son in Resurrection, despite their role and responsibility in one of the major events that went wrong. Ogi does show regret in the supplementary material after Callan's allowed to call the Black Knight's leadership out on their bullshit, that is also reflected in Resurrection, but is not shown doing anything to actually repent for it. Or rather, acts to repent for how the Black Knight stepped to the side in the movie continuity for no explicable reason. But of course, because of how the betrayal storyline was changed in the movies from them being deceived idiots that could have talked things out if they weren't idiots, into actively collaborating with Schneisel for their own gain, that is not the apology we wanted from him, as that is now for a completely different sin on the character that is likewise never resolved. Though how Valletta and him got together in the movie timeline is now itself a plot hole, since Shirley's role got written out of the films. And all for the worse, frankly, as the movie version with its rushing through the justifying parts of story events then locks in that Stockholm Syndrome interpretation of how the relationship forms. And it is to both of the characters' greater detriments. Valletta in several character respects is the opposing side parallel for Callan with how she's used in much of the series, acting as a counterpoint in their respective arcs with their desires. Callan inspiring loyalty to a cause, while Valletta treason. One not caring for the nobility she was given as it cost her all she valued, while the other covets that title due to her drive to bring prosperity to her family. Valletta realizing there's something more important which she embraces to the detriment of others, while Callan is consequently denied the same. Thus, without any of that which is set off by Shirley's role in things, R2's major events don't happen. Or at least only happen with very significant alteration to the circumstances within them, which the movies do not even pretend to depict. And if Shirley doesn't die, the circumstances and spiraling mental state that eventually causes Lelouch's death is not set off and should not occur. If Shirley lives, Lelouch doesn't end up meeting Suzaku in an attempt to guarantee Nunnally and Callan's safety, where he is then sold out to Schneisel. Without that, Schneisel doesn't get the circumstantial evidence from that encounter about Lelouch's culpability in Euphema's massacre he then uses to validate his deception that is key to making the Black Knight's leadership turn on Lelouch, even in the movie timeline. That event in canon likewise ties into Lelouch not believing Suzaku when he says he's carrying the series equivalent to a nuclear weapon. So if Shirley lives, Lelouch would have more stake in Suzaku's words of caution, so would not disregard what he thinks is a lie that ends up putting Suzaku into a position where he would be forced to either flee in dishonor, which he refuses to do, or use that WMD on the world's most populous city, which in turn, from its aftermath, makes Lelouch believe Nunnally died in the blast radius of the bomb. No confrontation between them, no use of a WMD should result. And if that WMD is not used, the Black Knights are not in a mindset to accept Schneisel's parlay that give him a chance to present his evidence, as they would have succeeded in that battle to reclaim Japan. Meaning Schneisel wouldn't be capable of dangling it as a prize for betraying Lelouch, and Lelouch would not have been wishing death on himself that makes him push Callan away and jump in front of a firing squad when the Black Knights betray him. If they do at all in this version of things. And could have potentially talked them down even if they decided to hear Schneisel out, as opposed to him screaming in Callan's face, "Betray me!" so she would get out of the line of fire when all seemed lost. And as a result, he wouldn't need to perform a hostile takeover of his homeland after he kills his father, which is required to make himself the enemy of the world as part of his suicide by cop endgame, or gather an army all over again to stop Schneisel's mass genocide scheme. None of that happens, or at least not in the same way, as all the connecting links in the chain of events have been cut in the movie timeline. And if that all sounds contrived with an excessive number of points of failure in its plotting, well, again, that's the R2 experience. There are so many ways to derail the series' endgame if the series weren't slaved to just progressing the narrative against all presented character to what was written from the start. This is also what I was talking about earlier with how continuing the Ashford plotline in R2 is actually such a huge problem for it. It only exists to keep Shirley as a significant cast member of the show, so her eventual death sends Lelouch into his self-destructive spiral, since he doesn't handle losing people well at all. And every mistake he makes after is heavily hinged on reactions made because of that event, as opposed to how they could have centered it on him being overwhelmed with concern for those he loves that are being held with a knife to their throats by his former best friend, and the distraction making him miss other immediate concerns with the larger war effort that makes the Knights lose faith in him, before Schneisel's scheme that enters play to take advantage of that. But again, because the Ashford plot superseded developing things with the Black Knights' growing discontent, their betrayal, which is far more important for the story, doesn't work. And they're instead presented as gullible idiots being deceived by a known enemy at the best of one of their own, who has no excuse for enabling this. And their betrayal, and Lelouch having to find a different way to save the world from the malice of his siblings, is key to what makes the ending that then results have such negative feelings towards it now. But because Code Geass's events so flow into each other, even when it's going against what a character should have done, and upsetting one derails everything that follows, the entire universe literally operates under a case of save the cheerleader, save the world, and Shirley's survival should prevent the worst case scenario of all the following events that lead Lelouch to die. Except in the case of the compilation movie timeline, where they have events of the series occur only absent any of the narrative causes to why they occur, and the individuals that make them occur having any relevance. And the makers of the film then expect you to believe everything that just keeps chugging along as if those missing gears on the machine of life never matter in the first place, despite them being why the wheel in the sky keeps on turning. Because the reason Lelouch inexplicably is made to survive Suzaku stabbing him to death in the movie timeline is Shirley drags his body away as she never died, despite her having no actual role in the events of the film continuity as she did in the series. And she's only there to do it as nothing that involved her previously in the main series actually happens. As if she's there to do that, why was Lelouch racked with guilt enough to try and absolve his sins in the way he does? And in interviews with staff, they've said that is the sole reason why they spared her death in the movie version, so she could do this. When anyone else could have done that, and she is literally the one person in the storyline that couldn't do that without breaking the entire series of events that leads to him dying. Especially because there already exists someone in that tale that could have done the same task without conflict. One I have only mentioned in passing. Sayoko Shinozaki! Sayoko happens to be Lelouch and Nunnally's maid at Ashford, and is a trained ninja shown to bear more loyalty to them than basically everyone but Callan. And it's a loyalty shown retained even after Lelouch's Zero Requiem plan gets started. Thus, if he considered the possibility of him surviving at any point, she'd be the one to pull him away so he could recover its secrets. But that such didn't happen also shows that he in no way planned for the possibility for his survival, which once more makes Suzaku bashing Lelouch's skull in during Resurrection that much worse a scene. As once more, all of this is how bad the movie continuity is. Again, it's not about the character shipping angle. That's just a symptom of the greater problem. It's about the entire story's narrative cohesion literally tearing itself apart because they ripped out all the connecting links of the chains that hold it together without considering the consequences. All to get Lelouch out of the picture to send him off with CC. As if the movie version's depiction of everything was plausible for the core story, then it once more begs the question of why the core series couldn't do that. But the core series, even at its worst, already answered that question of it being necessary for what comes next in it to occur. Thus, the movie's interpretation is consequently wrong. It's not something that can work both ways. Not with how the series has been constructed. And this specific observation actually makes things worse than you might think, as it exposes something very harsh about Code Geass as a story. For due to the compilation movie's horrible construction, it forces the audience to admit either one of two things, both of which I've discussed previously. Either A, Code Geass' story, as interconnected as it is one misplaced card in a house of cards from tumbling apart and making the interconnectivity of everything become absolutely meaningless, or work against everything else in the tale, which irreparably, and I do mean irreparably, breaks the story in ways that not even R2 ever managed to achieve. Or B, the construction of the movie timeline was done or insisted upon by those who literally do not know, did not remember, or could not understand what the hell was important in the story they were part in creating. Thus, all exclusions and alterations it makes are completely 100% arbitrary, as they don't have the capacity to grasp what was essential to the story's depiction to keep all pieces of it moving. And thus the movie timeline and any expansion it may have should be discarded as an absolute malicious waste of everyone's time. And yes, that does include bringing Lelouch back from the dead. As said, Shirley was a minor character, and yet everything connected to her story and death is made such a series of essential dominoes that it cannot be replaced without subverting the entire direction of what follows from it. Or if you must continue on from there, it must make the cast even worse, and in ways that are not reconcilable unless the writers intend to upend the entirety of the back end of the series. And as that is not what they did, there's little evidence they would have been capable of doing that in the first place. So it becomes a question of, keep this part of the story in so everything that happens as consequence of it is still allowed to happen, thus making the movie timeline once more worthless over the main series, or change things more substantially with rewrites of existing footage, with the subsequent consequences of exposing all the more the contradictions and inconsistencies the films are deliberately invoking to push their own agenda.
Whenever Poochie's not on screen, all the other characters should be asking, "Where's Poochie?"
And just to conclude this discussion of Shirley's role in the series, as I was going through footage of the show again, I noticed something that is pretty overlooked in the fandom as well. Before the Narita incident where Shirley's father dies, there was an evacuation called over the entire area, and those evacuation orders were heeded outside of those part of the military's Code R project, including Shirley's father. In fact, we see him and his co-workers refuse to evacuate, meaning all of the individuals who died that were not part of Cornelia's military faction were from that as well. In the moral, ethical, and legal senses, to refuse an evacuation order is to remove the liability of others over the events, and blame placed solely on those who refuse, as they abdicated their own safety. So while Lelouch may feel guilt over the event for not double-checking his math to prevent the landslide from hitting the town at the base of the mountain as hard as it did, he is not criminally responsible for those deaths, as they were military members who refused orders, and no civilians were actually caught in the landslide. And that's important because put in those terms, between this, Charles and Victor being responsible for triggering the events of the Special Administrative Zone massacre, Rolo acting against Lelouch's wishes to murder Shirley, Suzaku having the choice in how his Live command triggers over whether he fought or fled, and him choosing to fight and fire the Fleecia super nuke he was handed, so the command Lelouch placed on him cannot be blamed for that attack either, and also the reflection making it clear that Lelouch never killed anyone with the weapons of the Damocles, only claimed he would with such being an empty bluff. It means that he never is responsible for the circumstances which have killed any innocent civilians at any point in the series. He actually did live his mission statement that he says in his first appearance of Zero as never causing civilian casualties in the fight for liberation. There is no lie in this. It's just a matter of whether you paid attention to this fact or not. Whereas, once again, Suzaku, who Taniguchi thinks is the hero of this tale, only ever causes civilian casualties and suffering because of his unilateral thoughtless actions, because he never considers the consequences of what he fucking does.
Does that sound like a hero?
Well, when you put it like that, not really, but,
Then what the hell, man? What the actual hell?
It is, once again, why we are absolutely done with Sunrise refusing to acknowledge how horrible Suzaku is, and get so pissed off over Lelouch's demonization as the worst monster to ever live. Had this not been the case, had Shirley and Ashford's entire subplot in R2 not been as large an element of anything as I said, and the focus stayed on the Black Knight's loss of faith in Lelouch and the original story, maybe you could have gotten away with it. But the movie timeline spends even less on this plot than the show did. Doesn't lay the groundwork for Lelouch and Suzaku's devolving dynamics, so Suzaku looks worse than he is. Lelouch looks more imbecilic in falling for the things he does, as why he's overlooking them is not established, alongside him being depicted as a far more selfish individual. Callan, as said, is no longer an actual character, but a means for fan service with how they excised all relevance to her. And Cece is time and again made to be right, even though it is canon in the series that her actions and advice through the centuries, which she gave to her various contractors, are awful, and is directly tied to how the world got so screwed up in the first place, as age has not grounded her wisdom. She's not a Cassandra foreseeing the fall of Troy, or a witch from Macbeth. She's a typhoid Mary poisoning the well, so the people who can set things right keep having their time cut short. Again, I've been trying to not bash her character here, as I don't actually actively hate CC, but it's not hyperbole to say that part of how she is used as a story device throughout the franchise is she's 99% the cause of what went wrong in the story's historical difference from real life.
あなたはすでに死んでいる。私の力は命を刈り取る。そもそも命がないならあなたを倒せないのは当然ね。
生きた屍だ。
Though, to be fair to the CC shippers out there, this is also part of the one rationale you legitimately have to why Lelouch could want to be with the Immortal Witch, since the story itself does so little to validate that relationship route, as, again, it's very easy to write her out of the story. And that reason he could have is, if he is terrified of having the people he loves die, and keeps seeing that happen, then he would intellectually find comfort in being with an Immortal Witch he'd never have to suffer that pain with. Even if the story itself, in both continuities, presents the reality that he doesn't love her, and she's not supposed to feel that emotion in the romantic sense. As if he was supposed to be, then this is again how bad a job they did with this. 'Cause if he did love her, then the mind-wiped Lelouch they present in Resurrection, that is how he initially returns from death without memories of who he was, yeah, he would not be trying to get away from CC whenever we see them together, and being obstinate to doing anything with her as the film presents. Because who you love, that's not a mental thing. Not entirely. That's a spiritual and emotional thing, not tied to what's said to have been torn out of Lelouch. Those connections do not die just because you wipe memory of them away. You still want to be with them. This has been shown in reality with cases of amnesia patients recognizing loved ones and family members even though recollection of how they know them is blocked. And that's how the trope normally is applied in fiction.
私、あなたを覚えていない。でも、わかるの。あなたがそう考えているって。ユキ。古代君、一人じゃ無理。
以前の自分なんて思い出せないけど、多分そういうことを言うために体を張ったんじゃないと思うんだ。覚えてない頃の俺が今の俺を動かしてる。残ってるんだ。ここじゃなくてここに。だから多分俺はここにいる。俺がやるべきことならきちんとわかる。
And while that is dialogue from another series, it is not something that conflicts with the content of Code Geass, where that same thing is shown, and in fact is part of why Charles and his supporters so fail entirely with all their goals. People's hearts form the will that overcomes the mental conditioning of Geass. In the OVA series, Akito the Exiled, and the opening of R2, when Lelouch is under the mind-rewriting effects of his father's Geass, feelings for Nunnally despite not remembering who she is are the key to awakening him both times. Nunnally overcoming a Geass command that kept her blind for years is done because of her feelings for her brother and her need to confront him. Euphemia, on her deathbed, despite the command to kill Japanese people still being active, confesses her love for Suzaku, even though it should be making her try to kill him to her last breath. Suzaku turns his own cursed command, which adds Corey's just forcing him to have a flight or fight response, into a weapon by directing how it activates with his own feelings, so he actively ignores the flight response it should be triggering, so it then boosts his ability to fight regardless of what he does while in that state. Rolo forces his Geass beyond its limits to save Lelouch because of his feelings for his surrogate brother, and it kills him because of it. Even CC, when she herself seals away her own memories, attaches herself to Lelouch, because something makes her feel as if she can trust him.
お願い、ヤンマのボロパソコンをぶっ壊して。
そのボロいパソコンぶっ壊してやる。
てめえのお願いに体を支配されても塩辛のドタマは勝ったんだよ。寝てろ。
そのボロいパソコン秒でぶっ壊す。
早く足のお願い叶えてあげないと死んじゃうじゃん。
俺らはここで終わりでいい。
そこまで
王のために命あれから側近やってんだ。全部ぶっ壊
お願い聞いてやったぞ。
謝るなよ。ヤンマ間違ってない。
And moreover, the only person Lelouch himself shows any affection for while his mind is a complete blank in Resurrection is Callan. Because in those moments, his heart, not his mind, is in the driver's seat. And as said, the series' original writer deliberately was depicting them as having a bittersweet affection for the other that only now he would be able to express, when his own brain wouldn't be getting in the way. If he actually loves CC in the movie continuity, well, both the movie itself and what the staff have said about it makes that assertion problematic at best. The mind-wiped Lelouch that is running on solely the truest emotions of his heart wants nothing to do with her. Thus, the film's ending, where he leaves everyone for her, doesn't work how they want it to from evidence in its own damn content, regardless of everything else. Hell, I'd have less issue with the ending if it were for this aspect spending a lot of time telling us loudly what he wants without his own brain getting in the way. And Cece's own previous actions showing that such wasn't what she wanted from him in the first place. We had an entire filler arc about one of Cece's exes not being capable of fulfilling her death wish, and she'd abandon Lelouch without even trying to talk to him out of the Zero Requiem plan in both the original series and the movies if he will not be the one to kill her. Something that is impossible to square with any belief that they were in love with each other as well. As if Cece did love him, then she would have stopped at nothing to have him live, just as Callan endeavored to, even though she failed. And thus, like with R2, the movie timeline of Code Geass sacrificed good storytelling and the characters people gave a damn about in order to get to an ending they wanted that was fully in conflict with what had come before, and in no way had to be in conflict with everything as it was. Which again, was tipped off by the movie timeline working to demote Callan out of the deuteragonist role to promote Cece into it as the new official paramour, and doing so only further spotlighting Callan's mistreatment into the egregious sticking point it has now become with fans. Now, once again, to be clear, then deciding to officially start shipping Lelouch and Cece a decade after the series had concluded, and years after most of the side stories had ended, when most of that content made it clear there was nothing romantic between them, this said explicitly to be the case in the audio dramas, it's not the sole problem here. I'm not that obsessed with shipping for that to be the sole thing that broke the camel's back. But as is a central thesis of this review, Sunrise insisting on shoving Yukana Nogami to the foreground of this series' storytelling ends up doing nothing but harm in the long run, because Cece is one of the least interesting characters in it, and you can legitimately remove her from all of the story and affect nothing. And if they thought that legitimately screwing with the romance arcs after deliberately making them ambiguous was a winning strategy, they majorly miscalculated, as they have several times before. People do not like when the paramours of characters that have been built up over time end up getting derailed.
ロマーネ・ディアボーンにございます。私の美しさそのものが罪なのです。
わかるように話せ、サバケン。
As them doing that explains everything about what went wrong with Code Geass's compilation movies. For justifying that decision overrode all other matters, and led to them disregarding basically all of the side content and more than half the series. They legitimately did their best to write Callan out of the story to dissociate her from Lelouch's own, and as a character of any importance. Gutted most events tied to Lelouch's other potential paramours that had more evidence to them than CC did, and seemed to do so with the sole purpose of promoting CC into that story position to try and justify what Resurrection would later do with them. And it doesn't work at all as the base story actively conflicts with them on this. Callan still does exist, but she only is a minor character in the movies, despite how much she is all over the series and deeply tied and interwoven into Lelouch's own character story to enable events that build the momentum of the rebellion, him also coming into hers. Once more, it's canon within the original series and all the tie-in media that focuses on them that she did fall in love with him, and the reason Lelouch could not let himself return her affections openly was because if he did, he would be dragging her down to hell with him, and he couldn't do that to her. By that point in the story, so many people he cared for had died because of him that he couldn't let that happen again. By just his actions, he legitimately did care enough about her to let her go and be free to live, even if it left them as enemies, instead of changing his plans for her, which could result in her dying. And what's more, that wasn't fan-interpretive readings of canon for those trying to justify a ship. That was bold-lettered, we intentionally did this canon, which they for years reinforced with Oz and Akito, repeating those same narrative arcs and character relationships between its cast members to show how much that was intended between each one's main character trios. Or at least it was until it was changed for the movies. So, once again, it doesn't actually act to provide proper closure for anything because of this conflicting mandate, nor opens the stage for others to take focus. As in doing so, the movie really did destroy the stage and any avenues to tell more stories in the setting, as why should we care about anyone else who may be brought in now if the same mistreatment is going to happen with the grievances never settled?
This has made a lot of people very angry and been widely regarded as a bad move.
Now, to be fair,
To be fair.
much of that all keeps tying back to that setting establishment booklet that came with the movie. And the problem with that is that booklet was written before the movie script was finalized, with the Sunrise mandated changes, explaining its host of contradictions with the movie's timeline and resurrection in specific with where it spends its focus, despite the entire point of those booklets being to act as supplementary material primers to explain what the movie doesn't and set up what it was intending to do. But as has ultimately come to be my point in all this, to quote a more popular internet reviewer,
"If you need supplementary material in order for people to understand your movie, then you are failing as a filmmaker."
And that holds true to not just Resurrection, but the film timeline as a whole, without much essential important things were either contradicted or left on the cutting room floor, especially when it comes to pre-existing relationships. And the compilation movie's treatment of Callan as a relevant character is again what turned what had previously been a pattern of narrative malfeasance into the most screwed over character status she is now marred by, making her nothing but a minion to be used and thrown away as a chess piece pawn story-wise, turning what was acknowledged as an outright lie set in the original series to separate them so she would be safe from the consequences of his failures into a fact of the movie timeline that is then used to detrimental harm. And regardless of whether you agree with me on that, does not excuse or justify her continuously being reduced to being nothing more than Miss Gratuitous Action and lol boobs fan service, as she constantly ends up treated as in the movies. It is a massive insult to everyone who liked her as the second most popular character in this franchise. For even discounting the character shipping stuff, or thinking about the reasons behind character, thematic, and narrative actions, or if one didn't indulge in the side content, tearing out the second most important character in the story structurally doesn't do anything any favors, due to her being the one that made so much of it possible, just to make a path clear for him to leave the setting entirely with no other attachment to anyone, and justified by him hooking up with someone else that was not showcased to have romantic affection towards him beforehand. So it's no wonder the compilation movies were collectively trash fires with how they were stitched together. I cannot even undersell how they are the worst compilation movies Sunrise, hell, any company, has ever done. Because they're both focused on retcons and ripping essential cast out of everything, instead of trying to add to something the main series might not have addressed very well, like most of the Gundam compilation movies attempted, even though those compilation movies are also worthless. As not only did they make the intentions of the full arc of the original story thematically incomprehensible with how much they cut, condensed, and altered, they messed up every character interaction responsible for how the story progressed, which shows a fundamental lack of understanding of the series itself. Again, Code Geass R1 is still a story told as the result of character, people doing things in response to the actions of others, which makes sense with regards to the context of who those people are and what is occurring around them, even if all of that information is not strictly there in the text of the show itself. R2 is story direction prioritized to the detriment of character. People forced to do things in certain ways as it moves the plot to a predetermined ending by the effect of an action preceding its cause. But the compilation films are a story made from the contradiction and exclusion of character, as none of its changes allows it to justify itself because it makes no effort to explain why it is suddenly different, and just treats it as if it is the same, despite all the evidence to why they are not. Because instead of crafting a new story extension to a series that left open the door that Lelouch might not have died, and possibly been granted his father's code when he got them killed, so he ended up a code bearer, and immortal to then deal with the many loose ends left at the end of R2, they instead keep making excuses in the plot that completely jumps the rails, introducing something not justified nor explained by any lore previous to bring Lelouch back. And yet it still basically serves no actual difference from the long-proposed way to bring Lelouch back. Make him pseudo-immortal. But how they failed in that is, it's not to do more with the guy. It's to give him a permanent send-off so they don't have to do anything more with him, while still playing with the setting. Instead of a more temporary revival or shortened mortal existence that allows them better closure than the original ending left them, and allows the time to better resolve the unaddressed dangling story threads before you properly close him out. Which all once more ties back to that scene of Suzaku pummeling Lelouch and why it exists in the first place. Because Goro Taniguchi wanted to put the story of Lelouch to rest and have his role in the story and universe reach its end. Thus, one major interpretation of that scene is the director, through proxy of the characters, having the worst character in the series attack the lead that everyone loves, just because the audience spent the last decade wanting him back because of how unsatisfying the execution of R2, both metaphysical and literal, was, regardless of who may have influenced that direction. And the character because the director is saying he should not have come back. Yeah, this is from that supplementary booklet again. Taniguchi specifically wanted Resurrection to be the absolute end of Lelouch's story. Make him move to being a supplementary, non-existent character so the rest of the world could finally be opened up to any other protagonist and story. And was using him and CC going off together as the exact excuse to do just that. Not because Lelouch would demonstrably love CC, but because it got him out of the way. And yet with how they fucked up with the movie timeline by not settling what they should have, since they did not provide the closure that was needed again, the exact opposite happened. Fans of the franchise from this point onward either wanted a proper Code Geass R3 that was as removed from the movie timeline as could be done to do Lelouch's resurrection right, or have the franchise entirely die, as there is no plausible way to tell stories past this point anymore that aren't just a consequence of the cast devolving into being even bigger idiots. And that isn't a joke. From the point that Sunrise first announced the Rose series in 2021, what fans remained after the movie timeline have wondered if Sunrise would pull a do-over on the movie timeline just because of the negative feedback to the movies. It does not appear to be that case, but again, this is all the baggage Rose inherits, regardless of its quality, as consequence of how much the movies were disliked. Audiences don't want more Code Geass content if it's not either a true fix to Lelouch's story first, or an analog of Lelouch or Callan in the role like every other spin-off has been. For even the prior efforts to diversify who leads the tales just keeps coming back to those two opposing a Suzaku. And thus, there is no getting rid of them. And even trying to shows that they are not approaching the problem with any understanding of it. Thus, unlike the side stories that at least tried to open up the story to areas not previously explored, Resurrection is structured in such a way that it permanently closes all avenues of story extension beyond it. So anything that might be left to explore, yeah, there's no easy way to do it unless they want to deliberately undo the movie and admit outright how much they screwed up with it. Beyond this, they did that send-off in the worst way they possibly could. For as said, basically turning on God mode for Lelouch to show why everyone still needed the guy with them, after most of the film was everyone else flailing and failing to do anything right without him, showing that they can't successfully do anything without him, before shoving him off with CC as apparently she's made to be the one that didn't give up on him, when that is in contradiction with all other Code Geass media, as if CC had not given up on him at the end of R2, then he wouldn't have needed to pull his suicide gambit in the first place. She was there! She abandoned him instead of talking him out of going through with it. Thus she can't be one of those that was rooting for him to live all of this time. But that is all ignored, as it's just to set up a big middle finger to fans by having Lelouch run off with CC on their own to hunt down other Code and Geass bearers with no tools, support, or means by which to find them at all.
ありのままなんて怠ける口実です。リタはね、そういうくったらないけどみんなが持ってる欲望に勝っちゃうところがかっこいいんですよ。仕事はきついし、世界中から嫌われますよ。でも私だけはずっと一緒にいますから。全部違う。
Instead of, Lelouch reclaiming the title of Zero from Suzaku, who spent a year screwing up with the identity and wasting the peace his act was supposed to bring to make the entirety of the Zero Requiem worthless, which is still true of this movie timeline regardless, by the way, and afterwards having reclaimed command of the Black Knights after they learned how badly they screwed up, with focus on tracking down other Code and Geass bearers so the power of them won't screw over people anymore, and bring Callan in as someone who already knows it all to work with him, as the actual film ends with her rejoining the Black Knights anyways without any real prompt to do so. You don't even need to hard confirm a relationship or give Callan a Geass, as many wanted to infer she would take up CC's code in Lelouch's place to end CC's suffering and give him someone he wants to be with. It could have been implied there was just an agreement between CC and Callan going forward with regards to anything related to the three of them. Hell, Super Robot Wars 30 does that with the cast when it includes Resurrection as part of its crossover story, because 30's writers were well aware of the absolute loathing Code Geass fans have towards Resurrection's ending. And while they don't change anything, which is part of the large detriment of Super Robot Wars 30 overall, in how it was absolutely awful actually crossing over the properties, and having those crossovers play impact to prove the stories included, 30's writers made pretty clear that they're among the ranks that outright hate the film with how they use the absolute minimal amount of its story as they can, and are outright contemptuous of the idea of trying to justify the Code Geass movie timeline as having any form of legitimacy, and actually have such be subsumed by the plot of Gunsword, which is also featured in that game, to even further delegitimize it. When it comes to the SRW production team, you have to do a lot to make the staff of those games showcase actual contempt towards a property, and yet that seemed to be the view taken on that movie timeline. But had they taken that other route and not insisted on deliberately blocking it off, that then opens up Lelouch serving as a support or side character to any number of stories you would want to tell in the setting without requiring him take up the protagonist reins, and otherwise opened up the world in saying, yeah, job ain't done, maintaining peace for the world is going to be a full-time job, which could be followed by any story you might want to tell, instead of what they actually did in cutting off these characters entirely. Say, Cornelia having to come to terms with her past sins as she has to settle an uprising in one of the nations she previously conquered, or Callan having to use more of her tactical brain once she graduates into a true commander role, just as she had to when she was in charge of the Black Knights during the time skip to hold them together, and she finds herself asking, what would Lelouch do, and succeeding because she's the one person on the planet that can in any way claim to understand how he thinks. Or Suzaku finally having to acknowledge how badly he fucked up when he sees a version of himself be what's stopping him from settling things in a region of conflict. Use the actual characters as a source for storytelling with them, like most authors endeavor to do. But instead of any of that, we can't, and are actively prevented from doing so due to the wall that has been thrown up. All we have instead is, nope, all conflict in this world comes from Geass, so the only further stories will be ones that revolve around Geass users in small conflicts, not involving those with the most experience in dealing with such.
There's no new game plus. There are no harder enemies. There are new souls for you to get. There's no homeward.
But...
You're just regular boned. That's it.
No. No.
Welcome to die.
No!
Or hell, could we ever at any point address the elephant in the room that anyone cosplaying as Zero can get Schneisel off of his Geass command loyalty leash and allow him to become a super evil bad guy again? as that leash Lelouch put him on is not one that is going to hold forever, and his nihilism will continue to make him consider genocide as a valid option if he ever gets off it. But no, what they did is send off the character everybody cared about, screwed over the lead lady most people adored, remove the story device that has experience with and against odd cultist magics that affect and influence the modern world, and also fight against such powers being used, and just left available the guy most fans of the series can't stand, and supporting characters people were made to hate or never cared about that will have to face these kinds of things on their own in material going forward. If anything more than the Rose series and the Lost Stories mobile game is ever made for this franchise again, at least if it's not just another AU story. That, ladies and gentlemen, is not how you revive a concluded series to do more with it. That is how you do the opposite. I've spent most of the video just criticizing this because I legitimately cannot understand how badly the movie AU for the franchise screwed it over and closed more avenues for storytelling than it opened. And now fans don't trust them to do it right. And again, back to why the shipping thing is a player in that is, they legitimately did sacrifice all of the story contiguity of the prior tale just to try shipping these two in order to facilitate getting Lelouch out of everyone else's way. And even internally they failed. I honestly felt Cece and Lelouch had even less chemistry in the movie continuity than they did in the original series. For if Cece is in love with Lelouch and her contract with him is to find someone that will love her for all time, as opposed to fulfilling her canonical death wish with him as the prime candidate due to him needing to kill his uncle in vengeance for his mom's murder, which would then give him an immortality code, then why did she let him die in the first place as part of the Zero Requiem plan when there were alternatives for everything that would happen, and no guarantee he could join her in walking the earth forever after Suzaku assisted in his suicide? Hell, why not gain his favor in the story by telling him that she knows about everything tied to it, which we are told she knew from the start? Why not give him the information that would allow him to make the best decisions to ensure his survival? And if she really had affections for him, yet knew his mom and was canonically a member of his mother's court, it also means she's known him since he was in diapers. And the pictures and audio drama make it clear that she's watched over him the entire time he was in Japan until she got caught and experimented on. So what does that infer towards the possibility that this now has made it so she's possibly been grooming him his entire life to be her lover, as the movies now make it out to be?
Huh?
少年 H 計画は大成功よ。
少年 H？
大成功よ。ちなみに光源氏の H よ。
もしかして先生は6人目のヒロインかもしれないと思った。
While the TV show timeline subverts this train of thought outright as the execution of Mao's arc deliberately calls out the idea of her grooming a child to be a lover as disgusting and against Cece's morals, and thus played part in her rejection of him, tied to the audio dramas that make it clear that she is incapable of feeling romantic love due to asexuality. And considering the series ends up turning the resident lesbian into the creator of a weapon of mass destruction, the Ogi-Valletta romance is undermined by the Stockholm reading, and the view on Millie as a pansexual deviant harassment case, nixing that too for the movies isn't exactly a great look for the franchise, where they take an ace character and imply through the forced pairing that she's now depicted as a sexual predator. Not helped by how frequently alternative sexualities in interracial relationships are fraudulently depicted as predatory, despite the higher likelihood for such individuals to end up victimized than be an offender. And like the other screwed up relationships in it, the movie timeline has no answer nor means to refute this invasive thought without even CC herself as rewritten. But the most we actually get is just her deciding out of literal nowhere after it's too late to do anything that she has feelings for Lelouch at the absolute end of the compilation cut, where due to her backstory, that same reasoning is why she rejected Mao should apply. And it's only now she doesn't want him to die? That this is where she refuses to let it end? This only occurs after he's already committed himself to death and standing before the gallows. Thus it rings just as hollow as Suzaku's self-aggrandizing beating of the man in Resurrection, as everything done to add to her story to justify that turn doesn't, as she refused to act when it would have mattered which would reflect her truly bearing those feelings. And yet, he won't live for her. Callan in this debate at least has the excuse that Lelouch pushed her away so she wouldn't get caught up in whatever consequence would fall upon him, and she failed to break through his commitment to that path due to the distance he'd forced on her, just as he does eventually to everyone that truly matters to him. But she at least tried to break through it. He was just too far gone by that point for her words to act to reach him, without the proximity to literally slap him out of being stupid, or otherwise convince him to stray from it. CC was there the entire time he was orchestrating his own downfall, and yet did nothing to counter Suzaku encouraging his own self-destruction. So how are we supposed to buy that she actually loves him after that? And by him never seeming to push her away, the lack of this act itself shows an emotional distance from her that he lacks with those he truly values and placed in his heart. Consistency of character, and consistency of action because of character, as I've been trying to make the core of my argument, is pretty significant to their appeal, especially when it pertains to the flaws of said character. And Lelouch's issue of keeping those he loves away from him, his own expression of the age-old hedgehog's dilemma narrative trope, is kind of a big deal in that it plays part in many of the events that cause his downfall. So for her to be the one exception, in and of itself just does not make sense.
I have to go now. My planet needs me.
Wow, Poochie came from another planet? I guess.
We all know that sometimes when cartoon characters die, they're back again the very next week. That's why I'm presenting this sworn affidavit that Poochie will never, ever, ever return.
So to sum up, they killed it, they knew they were killing it, and they seem intent on killing again. So why pretend to prop up a dead body Weekend at Bernie's style, and telling everyone it's raring to go when you did everything to make it so that it would not live again? And furthermore, why bother sending anything that now follows in the continuity of the compilation films that did poorly? Because, again, you screw over even further the merits of the original work instead of working to respect it by making said original work irrelevant to the story you are now expanding and building upon because of how much it is contradicted to even have the new setting for stories, and make it so your built-in audience will want nothing to do with it. Because again, the reason why they did the compilation movies as a separate canon was, in their words, to not impugn the integrity of the original work. And yet that is all it feels like they did. But that is a symptom of a larger problem with these let's return to a setting for more projects across the board. And that instead of thinking on ways to actually follow the story people enjoyed before seeding a divergent note, they decide to toss that out and do whatever they want, no matter how little the root story would have allowed them to do that, or how little fans of that property want to see what they do happen. And the contradiction of story, character, and lore is what pisses people off as we got invested in these characters and their struggles and what was possible for them to do in their setting. So throwing all of that out and derailing their predetermined character paths that should have followed up on such if they were legitimately doing a sequel movie event comes off as a massive middle finger to the audience. And this is why I say the movie continuity is in conflict with character. Because analysis of why the cast do what they do from perspective of who they were presented to be before showcases the actions they perform are doing nothing but act in contradiction. Another thing a lot of people miss with the series tied to all this is Lelouch's tell. And once you know what that tell is, it adds an entirely new layer to the series as you can ferret out his real intentions every time. When he's lying, trying to hide his emotions, withholding shock or whatnot, his actual emotion is told through his hands and what gestures they make. Why his poker pose has his hands entwined is it's the only time he consciously makes an attempt to restrain that tell. And the animators took great pleasure in going nuts with them exaggerating those gestures when they could. The only time they didn't show his emotions through his hands or their body language as he had to lie or hide how he felt was when they were trying to deliberately deceive the audience or make ambiguous what he felt from our view in that moment, which in and of itself is the tell. So not showing that tell, in turn reveals to us something is up. Thus, the only way that explains how the film ends internally within the series itself, not how they were forced to act by outside mandates, with CC and LL going off on their own, is Lelouch is making excuses to be away from the people he holds deepest in his heart and pushing himself away from them, because he intellectually can't bring himself to be with them without screwing up everything he sacrificed for. So he instead will live a lie with CC, as he feels he owes her for not being able to fulfill her wish for death, and will instead fulfill her wish for companionship. But that is ultimately disingenuous to them and the larger story around them, nor what audiences really wanted, as it makes it so Lelouch learns nothing from his journey, and cannot even at the end of the day, when he's given the free opportunity to finally be honest with the people he cares for, put up anything other than a liar's smile. Zero Requiem, with him lying to turn himself into the villain, at least served a purpose in making it so his commitment to the final lie would bring a peaceful world, leaving it up to those he trusts to make sure it doesn't fall apart and becomes the truth from the seed of his true desire. That doesn't work in turn when that lie is then used as an excuse to stay away from the people he loves, who can help him with his own self-imposed quest to stop other Code and Geass bearers. And then if any sequel event to that show's LL isn't even doing that, makes everything all the more worthless as other members of the cast are then dealing with new Geass wielders and Code bearers without their help. If this was all done with intent to allow for sequel stories that explored that brand new world where people could be more honest and open because a lie paved the way for it, then they certainly attacked it from among the worst angles possible, as the obvious setup for such is that lie being exposed, and the people themselves having to grapple with the reality that it really is up to them to make things better, as they had been since Lelouch died. And some deific arbiter of justice shouldn't be needed for them to fucking play nice, since the world already stabbed that man in the back for making the attempt. That is how you go about ending the Zero Requiem, by showing that an entity like Zero isn't needed. And thus the Requiem is laying that discarded, unneeded mask at last to rest, to free those who wore it from its burden. So to begin wrapping up, I mentioned earlier in this review that the current state of Code Geass is similar to what happened with the Star Wars sequel trilogy, echoing a similar dynamic in how Gundam Seed and Seed Destiny themselves bear homage to the original and prequel trilogies of Star Wars themselves. And this relationship is somewhat better explained by an excellent video out there by the YouTube channel So Uncivilized that proposes the Star Wars sequels, due to their lack of forethought in planning, resulted in an anti-trilogy, that the makers of the films were so focused on undoing what they saw as the problems part of the previous creators' work that they ended up acting in contradiction to the merits of the prior world building. J.J. Abrams has such a disdain for the Star Wars prequels, and wanted to reassert the merits of the original trilogy divorced from them, that his works ultimately came to say that you can only tell the same old stories over and over again, and cannot draw something new from inspiration from the old, just redoing what others did and insisting that way is right, only to repeat the same errors and repetition. Rian Johnson's film thematically attempted to refute that, only to end up vastly exasperating the same error. His film interpreted under the view of trying to say that things should not be chained to the past, which in turn failed for many because it constantly showcased that it acted in ignorance of one's past and the lessons that had already been taught and learned from to not repeat the same failings, while acting as if it was the first time those very ideals had been introduced, only consequently done worse and in ways audiences did not widely accept. So instead of rejecting an unhealthy obsession with nostalgia, it instead acted to reject the fundamental concepts of world building, only to ultimately end up, like Abrams' film, derivative of and inferior to better stories already told. This is where the sequel trilogy left things thematically, which has made them so controversial. You cannot tell new stories without ruining what has been done, and you cannot tell old stories in new ways because those have already been told. Neither allows the story to move forward, as they don't address what is actually holding the narrative back, the contradiction in character the production thus invoked, as they did not ask what the problem was, only assumed they knew what was so. And that's ultimately the place where things have become stuck for Code Geass because of its movies. Due to everything that came before them, we don't want more of the old. We don't want Lelouch's existing story to be further changed in ways that fly in the face of what has already been done. The only tales you can tell now are by moving beyond those events to tell tales after them, which is only possible by bringing Lelouch back for real and resolving the issues of his scapegoating the movie timeline needed to the first time, which was by undoing the Zero Requiem entirely. And yet, this has become their blockade against doing so. Resurrection killed all possibility of doing that, and only served to forcibly separate the character necessary to tell those stories from those that matter to him, which would permit more tales to be possible. So there is now nowhere new to go unless they rebuild what they tore down first.
確かに俺の肉体は滅んだ。今の俺は神様だ。このままで終わると思うか。リバース。神様には時間なんて関係ないんだぜ。
And yet, that is unlikely that such will occur, and the Rose series will instead be brought down by all of this baggage. As such, would first require an admission that a mistake was made in trying to expel Lelouch and send him off into the cornfields with CC, and admitting that there is only truly one viable way forward that would make R2's frustrating ending just another intermission before the true final act were to then begin. But that in and of itself would risk undermining the bittersweet tones of tragedy and the meanings of the sacrifices made, with the admittance that ending things where they did, and the way they did, was a mistake. Only by showing that the job wasn't done to begin with, and some other force or power were to make those choices and sacrifices meaningless, could something ultimately sought to be salvaged. For just going back and reliving the past unchanged, that is fundamentally against what Code Geass is supposed to be. For what Lelouch ultimately came to fight for was for a future where the sins and atrocities of the past would never happen again, because they would be learned from. Attempting to make a story that does not do that, as Resurrection ultimately was, is fundamentally not a story that should be told within Code Geass. So at the end of this, what was the actual long-term impact of Code Geass? Because problems with it or not, it was very popular at its time, especially for a Sunrise series, to the point it has gotten more attention out of all their original properties short of Gundam. Well, as I discussed before, it expanded upon several elements of storytelling the Gundam Sidestories began, and increased focus on real-world elements being important to telling a story, individual character actions and motivations and how they interplay being a force behind the thrust and momentum of a tale. Machines piloted by people were often showcased after to move much more like people. The series expanded upon power supply for mechs being an important element and nerve in the story for why events in a setting are driven, or why characters need to break from battle they may be winning, or a reason for a loss. The role of strategists and tacticians, and for characters to be smart in how they act in the battlefield and abound, was given a much larger role, so it became less frequent that fighters in mech anime or battle-heavy series could just brute force their way through their enemies. This again was something done in ways before, a decade before even Code Geass got off the ground. Gundam Wing, Neon Genesis Evangelion, and King of Braves Gao Gaigar frequently showcased excellent use of planning and strategy by the cast of characters, but never with the same emphasis of importance, and now with a full army backing said strategists as opposed to a small team of specialists. Code Geass showed that in war series or ones bearing enemy occupations, that there are civilians that can be affected and have their lives ruined because of collateral damage, and did so not with one-off characters, but with the active supporting cast, and also reminded people that just because elements of a futuristic setting may be present, that it is still important to ground a cast to something relatable to increase one's engagement. A genius schoolboy just trying to make a better world for his sister and those he loves to live in, that hit the right marks, and very protagonists with similar goals and traumatic origins would see spotlight in Japanese media for years afterwards. at least when their airwaves would be accosted by deliberately written to be idiot protagonists. The series most centrally influenced by Code Geass in an immediate sense would be Gundam 00, as that series clearly took varying levels of inspiration with several of Code Geass's better executed elements, particularly with how it tied in the subplots of civilian characters affected by the acts of the Gundam pilot protagonists as a proxy representation of how their revolution of a world artificially split into military and economic blocks can divide them. And there are no easy routes to resolving the wars that these divides cause. And as is most centrally called out by the conclusion of the first season, making oneself a martyred enemy of the world is not a means by which to resolve the world's long-lasting problems, as it only leaves them open to further manipulations by the truly malicious. Code Geass's ending, both the series and movie, does not consider the political or economic repercussions, doesn't address the racial divides that infested the setting, and how the wealthy, even without nobility, can still gain political power and corrupt the system back to the way they wanted it to be, as so many people in the setting do not want change. And all of that is sidestepped by that ending and forgotten about, which can lead the cycle of war to start up again, only with Suzaku using the Black Knights as a tyrant enforcing the oppression. Lelouch's time as emperor may have dismantled the nobility's power, but it did nothing against their financial influence nor the classism present in the world on multiple levels. There are still innumerable divides between the people that doesn't make it so one person dying will or should bring peace, as there's no guarantee the people in it are capable of grasping the proper empathy to overcome these issues, especially not with who is in charge of keeping the peace. Gundam 00 I consider one of the best Gundam series, as in its own way it does address those matters, that their means of fighting does not resolve the conflicts in the world outright, but encourages people to be better by removing nefarious influences that can lead to resolution and progress by preventing exploitation of the vulnerable. Something Lelouch, despite that being his central goal, has not succeeded in, and was made to not succeed thanks to the betrayals he suffered. Nor is there sign Nunnally will achieve such because Suzaku only knows how to bash people's brains in to maintain a status quo, and the Black Knights Barcallan never grasped the meaning in their goal and how to be knights for justice. There truly is that much just left unaddressed, which was left up to Sidestories to try and remedy, which have all been acknowledged by other series drawing on elements of the Code Geass setting. And this is an ongoing experience, even amidst the glut of isekai series that have since flooded the airwaves. Ari Ferretta from Commonplace to World's Strongest recreates semblances of the dynamics between the cast and characters. Ari Ferretta quite blatant in its lifting of Lelouch and Suzaku's roles and dynamics, that the anime adaptation literally had to change the dialogue from the light novels because they ended up directly quoting summations of their respective viewpoints said in Code Geass. With the Suzaku equivalent, of course, not just being in the wrong, but being the man responsible for stabbing the Lelouch equivalent in the back. The Fire Emblem games 3 Houses and 3 Hopes has the dynamic of Lelouch and Suzaku recreated by the characters Edelgard and Dimitri, with the third faction head Claude acting as a different interpretation of Callan in their dynamic, with it taken to possibly even more extremes. As in any route but Dimitri's own, Edelgard is someone who first and foremost is working towards reforming a broken system, which requires the deposing of corrupt rulers and a church that has manipulated everyone into the worship of a deity that is the true cause of the strife between the countries. While Dimitri himself keeps trying to say that the other two factions are wrong because their actions might cause harm in the short term, despite leaving things the way they are, being just as destructive in the now, and would only be worse in the future. While Edelgard's route in the games is full on pushing and creating this reform and exposing the darkness and harm that has been hidden behind the scenes by those with power. And Claude's in turn the outside perspective that connects the threads of this lore regarding all the crimes of the church they have hidden. Whereas Dimitri's own is centrally about vilifying Edelgard by demonizing all of her actions, and robbing her of allies towards the reform she wants to see happen, leading her to be abused and victimized into being turned into a weapon by the very people who victimized her and others before, that Dimitri's actions have been working to defend. Dimitri's routes that act in defense of a corrupt status quo exasperate everything wrong with the world, And only by abiding his head up his ass perspective does it ever appear that Edelgard is the villain. For Dimitri drives his entire kingdom into a war because people don't agree with just him, as is seen throughout the other two routes, while Claude and Edelgard are far more reasonable people with ethics and morals that makes them flexible in the means of how they obtain their goals. But Dimitri just telling them, no, I won't upset things as they are, is everything wrong with the narrative about these characters in both these games. Dimitri, as one of the newer interpretations of Suzaku's failings as a character, has gotten a lot of deserved flack from Fire Emblem players. And to think he is the good guy is an opinion held by those who only played his route alone and the very limited perspective it has, and ignored all other routes and the story lore exposed in them to ever think he was right when everything else says he's the asshole making things worse. This is a modern game reinterpretation that once more exposes everything wrong with Suzaku, as Dimitri never thinks about anyone or thing but himself. Rias Gremory from High School DxD, according to writer Ichie Ichibumi himself, draws inspiration from Callan, a Callan that has embraced noble lineage despite wanting their own independence. And the balance breaker forms of the boosted gear and divine dividing were made in deliberate homage to the Guren and Lancelot, which is shown more visibly in the boosted gear's category queen form in how it directly homages the Guren Satan. Kyokai Senki is a very recent example of a series taking inspiration from Code Geass, and then it occurs in an occupied and divided Japan, where the youth of the nation have to begin their own struggles to fight back, but does so from a different angle of attack entirely. As I explored previously in my review of Super Robot Wars V, the 2014 Sunrise series Cross-Ange Rondo of Angels and Dragons is built upon having a protagonist that is the spiritual daughter of Lelouch and Callan in how their character traits and personal backstories are melded into hers, and her going through a more graphic reinterpretation of the classist racist setting where the haves prey on those disabled from having their same advantages, all while gaining their power and prestige from the slaughter and abuse of those not like them, with direct allegories viewable from other members of the two series casts, or at least with minor trait swapping. Schneisel and Mao being merged into one character for Cross-Ange's central antagonist, Embryo, an example. Or Ange's little sister Sylvia being an utter selfish bitch being viewed as an interpretation of Nunnally if she had grown up in the Britannian courts or was consumed by her hidden dark side, similar to how Julius Kingsley was such a counterpart to Lelouch. Again, there's more than enough differences with these other Sunrise series examples of taking inspiration from Code Geass to not consider them ripping it off. But the differences that are there still show the same consequence as there has been with the Universal Century Mobile Suit Gundam series. There are deep divisive flaws with the material that can be avoided in other original settings to ultimately better build a story there. Or at least one that does not make the same mistakes with how they wish to tell their own tale with the elements they were inspired by. And throughout the rest of this year, I will be looking at Super Robot Wars X that gives a different alternate post-ending story for Lelouch and Callan's tale, as well as 2 more games that took inspiration for their characters and arcs from this series, Persona 5 and Tales of Graces. For the impact of Code Geass has ultimately had long-reaching effects, and it really just is a disappointment that due to the grander picture presented and how the staff of the series made so many mistakes and decisions I and others vehemently disagree with, I largely cannot look back on it without disdain. Or at least, that's how I would have ended all of this had that perspective not changed in 2023. For you see, among all the series that homage or parallel the story of Code Geass, even ones I have not mentioned here, there is one, and only one series to date, that has managed to perfectly redo nearly every essential important aspect of its tale, and yet not fumble its landing. Which one is it? Well, I think you guys should know by now. After all, I've been using clips from it this entire time.
絢爛の女王姫の乱
カムキロイオーシャ
不動のリタ・カニスカ
パピオンオーシャ王道の大殿様カグラギ・ディモースキーキャッチオーシャ狭間のジェラミー・ブラシエリスパイダークモノス赤子とアホーには包丁を持たすな私はもっとふさわしい方を知っています誰が王にふさわしいか私に民にお見せください邪悪の王ギラキングコマピラートオーシャー我ら王様戦隊キングオージャー何のためにあると思う？びっくりのためさ。ほら！
今のあなたを見て確信した。死を忘れた者はきっとあなたと同じ末路をたどる。死を求めて死をばらまく。死があるから生きることは美しいの。
ごめんねジェラミ
どう？伝えたかったことがあるんだ。愛してる。
ありがとう。
永遠は寂しすぎる。物語には一つだけなくてはならないものがある。これでおしまいだ。
どうして夕焼けって美しいのかしら。
ほんの一時の儚いものだからさ。
命も同じね。
全部奪われてる。ゼロから一つ一つ。てめえらの範囲教えてやる。一応舐めやがったからだ。泣く準備しとけスカボンたぬき。言葉にできない思いは体でぶつけるんだ。
我が
王を裏切るのか。
私は生きたい。私の王はキラだ。
ただ一人の力なき反逆に何の意味がある。
それは貴様のことよ。孤独の王は王にあらず王でありながら王たるを捨て結束する。今より貴様をひねりつぶす。
2000年重ねた歴史が背負えるか。英雄の責務が担えるか。未来を救う唯一の道。その道の先で必ず民を救え。
新たな歴史を担う王として
血を吐い泥をすすろうと懐に秘めた刀は折れず。
ダークなる意志のもと私たちは剣を抜く。
物語奴の悲鳴で締めくくろう。降臨せよゴッドキングオージャー。主教大主教。 まか。所詮子供の幻想だ。情けない。それで王とは笑わせる。不可能を可能にもできずに何が王か。幻想を現実にもできずして何が王か。民のためなら世のことありをも超越する。それが王だ。俺は私は王様だ。王様戦隊キングオージャー、今より貴様をひねり潰す。
And King-Ohger being nearly flawless in its execution, bearing none of the baggage Code Geass came to be buried by, is what finally allowed me to let it go. Sure, the movie timeline is the absolute worst, and harms everything I and others genuinely loved about the series, and only compounded the problems had with it. And I hope Sunrise will finally recognize that if Rose the Recapture does poorly. But something like the Lost Stories mobile game seems to have learned the lesson and continues to do well, as that mobile game does far more right by the characters Sunrise insisted be most wronged. And from everything I've seen of it, does its best to expand on what fans at one point did like. But in the end, that's the key there. Did like. Past tense. For that is the worst part of it all, and the part I most hate that I have to say. I can't recommend the series in the form it is now. For we might never have justice for the narrative malfeasance Code Geass suffered. Lelouch may never have his name cleared so he can be with the ones he loves. Callan may continue to be screwed over and never have her affections returned. Suzaku will continue to live and harm the lives of others with the assumptions he makes. And any continued use of the power of Geass in new entries might just make it all the worse. It's likely to remain a broken mess. But we have options now. We have other series that will do what Code Geass refused to. From the Rebels of Scry to Gunsword to Back Arrow. From the remnants of Spice and Wolf to DxD to G-Witch. From the fight against a man trying to proclaim himself God in Gundam 00 to Cross-On to Persona. And the will of masked saviors from Black to Kabuto to King-Ohger.
自分が変われば世界が変わる。それが天の道。
And possibly in new renditions of Super Robot Wars that will try and fix what Sunrise refused to. 15 years on, audiences have wised up to what went wrong with Code Geass. And while executives might not, and not every analysis reaches the heart of the matter, it's ultimately the death of 1,000 cuts. All begun when someone else thought they knew better than to listen, and only sought to subjugate.
英雄じゃない。王冠をいただく戦士。
罪には必ず罰を与える。
そして王は民のためなら手を汚す。
さあ幕引きだ。
王様ごときが足に勝てるわけねえだろ。
王様戦隊ならてめえを超えられる。
ふざけられんのもここまでだ。
And yet, no matter what series may draw inspiration from it, no matter how much time has passed, no matter how much the series undergoes reevaluation or reinterpretation, and how much Sunrise may or may not screw with the franchise in the future, there is nonetheless one absolute of the series that cannot be denied. There is not, nor shall ever be again, a character just like Lelouch v. Britannia. Regardless of anything else, that will keep people returning to the series again and again, no matter its faults, to see his rise and fall, all for the people he loves. And that is no lie. Or is it?
This お前に不死身を殺す力を与える。盾キラ、宇宙を救う時だ。やれ、キラ。骨をかぶり、終 シュゴッドの2000年の諸悪を血にまみれ永劫続く戦いと滅